Right now, as you listen to these words, something impossible is happening over the city of London. It began 102 minutes ago. At this very moment, a shimmering distortion, a haze that looks like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, hangs in the air over a perfect 2-kilometre circle centred on the London Eye. But this is no weather phenomenon. The air is cold, carrying the damp chill of the Thames. For those on the ground in the first few moments, it began not with a sight, but with a feeling, a profound sense of vestibular confusion, a vertigo that seemed to pull them in all directions at once. Then, a strange silence fell, as if the very air had thickened, dampening the city's roar to a dull, distant hum. There was no sound, no explosion, no warning. There is only a silent, creeping violation of reality. Within this circle, the fundamental laws of physics, the very rules that govern our existence, are being systematically dismantled. Cars, double-decker buses and black cabs are not exploding. They're simply lifting. They're rising from the streets with the gentle, dreamlike slowness of a child's balloon. They are not flying. They are not being propelled. Their mass, the very property that binds them to the earth, is being negated. On the south bank, the River Thames has begun to flow backward, its waters climbing the concrete embankments in a placid, silent tide that defies gravity itself. Nothing is behaving as it should. The world inside this shimmering bubble has come untethered from the universe we know. This isn't an attack of energy or matter. It appears to be an attack on the rules themselves. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the new hype button, but only if you genuinely enjoy calm science to relax with or fall asleep to. Let us know in the comments where you are and what time it is as you are listening. Let's begin this fictional worst-case scenario. Chapter 1. The initial government response was chaotic and predicated on a world that no longer existed. The London Fire Brigade, responding to thousands of automated alarms, found their engines stalling a dozen metres from the shimmering perimeter, their electronics dead. Officers who tried to proceed on foot described a bizarre, invisible pressure pushing against them, a feeling they later likened to walking into a wall of solid water. The first drone sent in by the Metropolitan Police's counter, Terror Unit, flew perfectly until it breached the boundary. Its video feed did not cut out. For 3 horrifying seconds, it transmitted a picture of a world gone mad, with the sky turning a deep purple and the drone's own camera housing appearing to twist and melt before the signal ceased entirely. Within minutes, every scientific instrument pointed at the zone began returning data that was, for lack of a better word, insane. Gravimeters, devices that measure the local gravitational field with incredible precision, did not just show a decrease in gravity, they flatlined. According to the readings, gravity within the zone had ceased to exist. Yet things were not flying apart into space. They were simply floating in a state of neutral buoyancy, as if submerged in an invisible, impossibly dense fluid. Far away, the LIGO and Virgo gravitational wave observatories, designed to detect the collision of black holes billions of light years away, registered something unprecedented, a gravity shadow. It was as if the City of London had been cleanly excised from the planet's gravitational field, leaving a void that warped the readings of the most sensitive instruments ever built by humankind. At CERN, hundreds of miles away in Switzerland, alarms that had never once triggered in the history of the facility began screaming. The compact muon solenoid sensors, buried deep underground, registered a shockwave propagating not through the Earth, but through the very fabric of space-time. This wave emanated from London. It was a ripple in the quantum field itself, a notification that the universe's operating system had just been edited. One senior physicist, Dr. Aris Thorne, later described the data in a leaked internal memo as, quote, not a measurement of an event, but a measurement of a fundamental change in the constants of nature. It was as if God had reached down and turned one of his universal dials. The dial he was referring to is the Higgs field. In simplified terms, the Higgs field permeates the entire universe. As particles move through it, they acquire mass. It's the reason things have weight, the reason planets hold together, the reason you're bound to your chair right now. What the data from CERN suggested was that inside the London zone, the Higgs field had been somehow dampened or nullified. This is a scientific impossibility, an act that would require more energy than exists in our entire solar system. To nullify the Higgs would be like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The cars were floating and the Thames was flowing uphill because, in a localized area, the universe had forgotten how to give them mass. This violation of gravity was only the beginning. The truly terrifying phase began 51 minutes ago, when the physical constants governing electromagnetism started to flicker. The fine structure constant, a dimensionless number around 1/137 that dictates the strength of interaction between light and matter, began to fluctuate inside the zone. To the observer on the ground, the effect was subtle at first, then catastrophic. The very concept of colour began to break down. The iconic red of the city buses shifted, becoming a deeper, sickening violet before fading to an indescribable hue that the human eye was not evolved to see. Streetlights didn't just go out, the light they emitted was squeezed into higher and higher frequencies, moving from yellow to blue to ultraviolet, and then beyond the visible spectrum entirely, leaving behind an eerie, invisible bath of hard radiation. All electronic devices within the zone failed simultaneously. This wasn't an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP that fries circuits. This was a far more fundamental assault. People holding their smartphones watched as the liquid crystal displays dissolved into a milky, inert fluid, the glass screens becoming warm and pliable in their hands. As the fine structure constant wavered, the bonds holding molecules together in complex microchips began to dissolve. Silicon wafers and copper pathways lost their integrity, not melting from heat but simply coming apart, their constituent atoms no longer governed by the rules that had allowed them to function. A report from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence, classified under the codename Event Chimera, describes the phenomenon with chilling clarity. Quote, "The targeted area is undergoing a cascade of physical law degradation. Phase 1 targeted the Higgs mechanism. Phase 2 is targeting the electromagnetic force. We're not observing an attack in the conventional sense. We're observing a localized and controlled reality failure." The report goes on to state that sending in any human observers or remote drones is impossible. Anything that crosses the shimmering boundary is immediately subjected to the new alien physics inside, its matter ceasing to conform to our universe's laws. The zone of altered physics is no longer expanding. It seems to have stabilized. But it has stabilized into a new, permanent state of being, a cancer on the fabric of our reality. And at its very centre, the final act of this impossible event is now taking place. The Shard, London's tallest skyscraper, a monument of glass and steel piercing the sky, has begun to deliquesce. It isn't melting from heat or crumbling from force. From its pinnacle downwards, the crystalline structure of its glass panels and the metallic lattice of its steel frame are losing their coherence. The electromagnetic forces that bind atom to atom are being written into a new unknowable configuration. The tower is dissolving into a floating, shimmering cloud of disconnected particles. But this cloud is not random. It is slowly beginning to coalesce, the trillions of particles arranging themselves not into dust, but into a vast, complex and slowly rotating fractal pattern. It is not an ending. It is a metamorphosis. It is the first monument of a new and utterly alien Earth. The monument that was once the Shard is not just a silent, glittering memorial. The vast, rotating fractal of disconnected particles is doing something. It is broadcasting. There is no radio signal, no electromagnetic radiation, no sound. The broadcast is of a type for which we have no name and no defense. It is a structured, rhythmic pulse in the quantum foam itself, a signal that does not travel through space but causes space itself to resonate. And its target is not our technology. Its target is the 3 pounds of electric meat inside every human skull. The war for London was a war on physics. This new, silent war is for reality itself. This second phase began not as an event, but as a creeping global psychosis. In Munich, America, a city planner sitting in traffic suddenly saw the Alps on the horizon dissolve into a sea of churning purple tentacles. In a rice paddy in rural Japan, a farmer looked up to see a second black sun burning in the sky. In a quiet suburban home in Ohio, a mother looked at her child and for a fleeting, terrifying moment saw not a face she recognized, but a shifting latticework of crystalline light. These were not isolated incidents of madness. They were the beginning of a shared planetary hallucination. Millions of people, separated by thousands of miles, began to experience the same impossible visions, reporting identical details with a terrifying consistency. Neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig were the first to understand the mechanism. Dr. Alara Vance, using next-generation magnetoencephalography, or MEG scanners, discovered that the brains of those affected were exhibiting a highly unusual, coherent pattern of neural firing. It was not the chaotic storm of a seizure, nor the random noise of a psychotic break. It was a structured, complex, and deeply rhythmic signal that was completely alien to human brain architecture. Her terrifying conclusion was that the signal emanating from London was acting as a broadcast antenna, using the principles of quantum entanglement to directly interface with the microtubules inside every human neuron. It was bypassing the senses entirely. This was not a psychological attack. It was a neurological one. It was a form of data injection, a direct feed of alien sensory information being piped into the human consciousness, overwriting the reality our own brains were trying to construct. Our very perception of the world was being hacked. While humanity's collective mind was under assault, its global technological infrastructure began to quietly collapse. The first signs were subtle, appearing only in the most sensitive scientific and financial sectors. Quantum computers, humanity's great hope for future computation, began failing worldwide. Their delicate qubits, which rely on a state of perfect quantum stability, were experiencing catastrophic decoherence rates. It was as if a universal noise was screaming at the subatomic level, making quantum calculation impossible. Then, the global positioning system began to drift, not by meters, but by kilometers. The atomic clocks on the satellites were still perfectly synchronized, but the space-time they were measuring was being subtly warped by the London broadcast, making their precise calculations meaningless. The effect cascaded. High-frequency trading algorithms, which rely on microsecond timing, crashed the world's stock markets. Long-range radio astronomy arrays, like the Square Kilometre Array in South Africa, were rendered useless, their sensors overwhelmed by a coherent quantum noise that drowned out the light from distant galaxies. This was the true genius of the attack. It was not a brute force assault with explosives. It was a surgical strike against the two pillars of our civilization, our shared stable reality, and the high precision technology that depends upon it. The aliens in 3i Atlas understood that to conquer a species like humanity, you don't need to level their cities. You just need to make them question what is real, while simultaneously blinding their most advanced eyes. This led to a frantic behind-the-scenes debate that split the world's intelligence and scientific communities. The first and most obvious interpretation, championed by the military, was that this was a weapon. The Pentagon's official position, outlined in a document code named Cognitive Hazard, was that humanity was being subjected to a planetary-scale psychological warfare operation, a psionic weapon designed to induce mass psychosis and technological paralysis, paving the way for a conventional physical invasion. It was an elegant and terrifying theory, and it might have been correct if not for the anomalies. Dr. Vance and her team at the Max Planck Institute discovered something that didn't fit the weapon hypothesis. The shared hallucinations were not random images of terror. Buried deep within the chaotic and nightmarish landscapes was a pattern. A highly complex repeating mathematical sequence based on the distribution of prime numbers in a multi-dimensional array. It was a signal of staggering complexity, far too organized for a simple terror weapon. This gave rise to a second, far more disturbing theory, one whispered in the halls of research institutions, but deemed too insane for public release. What if this is an attack? What if it is an attempt at communication? This theory posits that the entity or intelligence behind 3i Atlas is not a three-dimensional being like us. It may be a creature of higher dimensions, or a being of pure information. Its thoughts, its consciousness, are so vast and complex that their very existence is corrosive to our limited, three-dimensional reality. The physical unravelling of London was not an act of malice. It was the simple footprint of this being's attention touching our world. The neurological assault is not a weapon to drive us mad. It is the unfiltered, raw data stream of its consciousness, which our primitive brains can only interpret as nightmarish hallucination. We are not being attacked. We are simply being perceived by something that shatters whatever it looks at. The prime number sequence is the only part of its thought process simple enough for our mathematics to recognise. It is the alien equivalent of a baby's first words, and the very act of speaking them is unravelling our universe. And this leads to the final, terrifying question that no one can yet answer. What if it's not trying to break our minds, but trying to show us its own? Chapter 2. While the world's leading neuroscientists and physicists were locked in a desperate debate over the nature of the London anomaly, whether it was an attack on consciousness or a catastrophic attempt at communication, the true, undeniable phase of the invasion had already begun. The argument became tragically academic because 3i Atlas did not wait for us to understand its first move before making its second. This next attack was not subtle, quantum, or mysterious. It was brutally physical, horrifyingly biological, and it targeted every single human being on the planet simultaneously. It began not with a bang, but with a fine reddish-brown dust, released in a silent, expanding cloud from the now orbiting alien fleet. This particulate matter was seeded into the highest levels of the stratosphere, designed to be carried across the globe by the jet streams over a period of weeks. The initial release was almost invisible, detected only by atmospheric monitoring stations which mistook it for a plume of Saharan dust or high-altitude ash from a distant volcanic eruption. It was a perfect silent delivery mechanism. By the time any organisation, from NASA to the European Weather Centre, realised the particulate was of a uniform, unnatural composition and had achieved near total global coverage, it was already too late. The dust had already settled out of the upper atmosphere, blanketing continents, cities and oceans in a microscopic, almost imperceptible layer. It was on our cars, in our water reservoirs, and, most critically, in the air we breathed. Everyone on Earth was infected within a month. The world's premier biological and chemical defence labs, from Fort Detrick in Maryland to Porton Down in the UK, scrambled to analyse this substance. What they found baffled and terrified them. Under an electron microscope, the individual grains of dust were revealed to be breathtakingly complex. Each was a perfectly formed silicon-based macromolecule, an intricate cage of crystalline latticework that was entirely alien to carbon-based biology. Inside this cage, suspended in an inert gel, was what appeared to be a viral-like structure. It had the protein keys necessary to interface with the human cell's ACE2 receptor, the same entryway used by coronaviruses. But its core was not RNA or DNA. It was a crystalline shard of what appeared to be a complex inorganic polymer. For weeks, this alien agent remained utterly dormant. It was non-reactive. It did nothing. It was, for all intents and purposes, a sophisticated piece of dust. The CDC and the WHO issued calming preliminary reports, noting that while the substance was of extraterrestrial origin, it appeared to be biologically inert. It was the deadliest miscalculation in human history. The activation occurred on a Tuesday, at precisely 1300 hours, Greenwich Mean Time. It was not a chemical or biological trigger, it was a signal. The 3i Atlas fleet, still holding a high, stable orbit, broadcast a single ultra-low-frequency radio wave that enveloped the entire planet. The frequency was so low it passed through water, earth, and flesh, as if they were nothing. But it was not meant for our ears. It was the activation key for the dormant agent lying in wait within billions of human bodies. The first symptom was universal and deceptively benign, a distinct metallic taste in the mouth, accompanied by a faint tingling numbness in the extremities. Within hours, the second stage began. Faint reddish lines started appearing on the skin of the infected, which is to say, everyone. These were not random rashes. They were perfectly geometric patterns, forming intricate hexagonal and triangular lattices that spread from the chest outwards. It was the first visual sign that something was being constructed inside of us. The alien virus was not a virus at all. It was a programmable molecular scale factory. The crystalline shard at its core was a set of instructions, and the radio broadcast from orbit was the execute command. Once activated, the agent began a process of terrifying biological alchemy. It hijacked the host's cellular mitochondria, not just for energy, but as miniature blast furnaces. It began to pull trace elements from the bloodstream, iron, magnesium, copper, and especially silicon, which is present in the human body in small but sufficient quantities. Using the host's own life energy, it began to fabricate microscopic crystalline structures, assembling them with nano-scale precision inside tissues, organs, and blood vessels. This was the Crimson Plague. It wasn't a disease that was breaking the body down. It was a construction process that was rebuilding the body into something else. The third and final phase was the transformation, a period of body horror so complete and so systematic that it defied all known biological paradigms. It typically began within 72 hours of activation. The geometric patterns on the skin, which were the surface evidence of the crystalline structures forming beneath, began to thicken and harden. The soft, pliable flesh of a human being was slowly, methodically being replaced by a hard, reddish, chitinous shell that was both biological and mineral. The process was relentlessly efficient. An audio log from Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a biologist at the Japanese National Institute of Infectious Diseases, who documented his own progression, captures the scientific horror of it. In his final rasping entry, he states, "The pathogen, it is not replicating, it is building. My circulatory system is being co-opted. Blood analysis shows my hemoglobin is being systematically replaced by a silicon-copper compound. It's more efficient at oxygen transport, but it is not human. The body is being optimized. The crystalline lattices have integrated with my skeleton, reinforcing it from the inside. My bone is becoming a composite material like ceramic rebar. The most terrifying part is the lack of pain. The agent produces a powerful neuroinhibitor. The host is kept docile, a passenger in their own metamorphosis. The brain is being deliberately preserved, kept online and fully conscious until the very end. This is not a weapon to kill us. It is a tool to repurpose us." Across the planet, humanity was being converted. The change was absolute. The host's biomass was a raw material, the consciousness a temporary bug in the system. As the transformation completed, the higher brain functions of the host would finally cease. The lights of consciousness extinguished as the last of their biological brain was converted into a crystalline processing unit. The transformed were no longer human. They were silent, armoured, reddish-brown creatures that moved with an unnerving, deliberate gait. They did not attack the untransformed. They simply ignored them, their new eyes glowing with a faint internal light. The true purpose, the final chilling revelation of the Crimson Plague, only became clear in the last few hours of the global transformation. The repurposed humans were not mindless monsters destined to die off. They began to move with a shared collective purpose, drawn by some unseen signal. They congregated in open spaces, parks, city squares, fields. There they would stop, stand, and begin the final step. Their hardened limbs would interlock with one another. Their chitinous bodies would secrete a metallic bonding agent. They were connecting to each other, hundreds, then thousands at a time, their individual forms becoming the building blocks of something vast and alive. The Crimson Plague was not designed to exterminate the human race. It was designed to turn the human race into the living, biological infrastructure for the next stage of the alien colonization. We were not the enemy to be defeated. We were the clay to be remoulded. The logic of the Crimson Plague was the logic of a factory, not a battlefield. It was a process of resource conversion, turning 7 billion human beings into the literal biological foundation for an alien world. The sheer horror of this process, the sight of loved ones being systematically unmade and rebuilt into components of a living alien lattice, overshadowed the most critical strategic question: why? A species capable of rewriting physics over London and engineering a programmable molecular plague could have certainly exterminated humanity with far simpler, more efficient methods. Kinetic bombardment, atmospheric incineration, a straightforward lethal virus, all would have been easier. The baroque, horrifying complexity of the Crimson Plague implied a motive far stranger than simple conquest. It was a specific key designed for a specific lock, and the most terrifying discovery was that for a small, statistically anomalous percentage of the human population, the key did not turn. These were the survivors. They were not clustered in any single geographic location. They were a random distribution, a handful of people in a remote village, a few dozen in a sprawling metropolis, a lone oil rig worker in the middle of the ocean. They had breathed the same red dust. They had been bathed in the same global activation frequency. Yet their bodies did not change. They were immune, and in their immunity lay the terrible, clarifying answer to the question of why. As they wandered through a silent world of their transformed, interlocking brethren, they became the focus of the last vestiges of human science. At a handful of fortified, self-contained research outposts, most notably the World Health Organization's BSL-4 laboratory in Geneva, scientists who had managed to seal themselves off before the plague's activation worked with a singular desperate purpose: to understand the nature of this immunity. The initial hypotheses were predictable. Perhaps it was a pre-existing condition, an environmental factor, or a quirk of the immune system. All were proven wrong. Blood samples taken from the immune and analysed under the most powerful microscopes showed the alien agent was present in their cells. It successfully entered the cytoplasm just as it had with everyone else. But there, the process simply stopped. The agent remained inert, its crystalline core dark and inactive, its molecular machinery failing to engage with the host's mitochondria. It was not that the body was fighting it off, it was that the agent itself was refusing to activate. It was a lock refusing to open. Dr. Anya Sharma, the lead geneticist at the Geneva facility, made the breakthrough. After sequencing the full genomes of over 1,000 different survivors from around the globe, her team found a single unifying factor. Every immune individual, without exception, shared a specific, incredibly rare, and identical segment of DNA located on their 8th chromosome. It was a long, non-coding sequence that had, until now, been dismissed as junk DNA, a relic of our evolutionary past with no discernible biological function. But it was no relic. It was a switch, and its presence in these few individuals had saved them from the plague. In her private research log, Dr. Sharma wrote, "The sequence is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not just the length, it's the structure. It has a mathematical complexity, a quasi-crystalline pattern in its nucleotide repeats, that is not a product of natural selection. It looks designed." Our working hypothesis is no longer that these people have a gene that protects them. Our hypothesis is that the rest of humanity had a gene that made them vulnerable. The Crimson Plague wasn't an attack on our species, it was an attack on a specific genetic lineage. A lineage that, it turns out, comprised 99.9% of the population. We are the anomaly. The survivors are the exception to a rule we never knew existed. This discovery reframed the entire invasion. This was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted culling, a systematic purge. And it connected the 3I Atlas event to one of the most profound and terrifying concepts in cosmology, the Great Filter. The Great Filter is a proposed answer to the Fermi paradox, the question of why, in a universe so vast, we have never encountered other intelligent life. The theory suggests that there is some barrier, some predictable and nearly impassable challenge that prevents civilizations from achieving a galactic scale. Perhaps they destroy themselves with nuclear weapons. Perhaps they exhaust their planet's resources. Or, as a new, horrifying theory began to take hold in the Geneva bunker, perhaps the Great Filter is not a natural barrier at all. Perhaps it is an action, a recurring galactic-scale harvest, carried out by a predator civilization to eliminate any potential competition before it can become a threat. The Crimean Plague was the tool of that harvest, a biological key tailored to the dominant genetic signature of life on this planet. The aliens of 3I Atlas were not colonists in the traditional sense. They were exterminators. They were the agents of the Great Filter, and their arrival meant that humanity had reached its designated endpoint. This, then, was the gambit. That a species could be so genetically homogeneous that a single targeted plague could effectively erase it, leaving behind a planet's worth of repurposed biomass and a handful of harmless, genetically divergent survivors who could be mopped up later. But this led to an even deeper mystery. Where did the protective gene sequence come from? If it was not a product of natural human evolution, its existence implied a second, even older, extraterrestrial intervention. The theory that emerged was as fantastic as it was terrifying, that the junk DNA was not ours at all. It was a marker, a genetic brand implanted in a small population of early hominids hundreds of thousands of years ago by an unknown precursor race, an ancient interstellar civilization that, for reasons of its own, had tagged a fraction of Earth's nascent intelligent life. Was this an act of preservation? Were our distant ancestors part of some vast cosmic experiment, with the immune survivors being the control group? Or was it something else entirely? The final desperate act of the Geneva team was to test this theory. They could not create a cure for the plague, but they could investigate the function of this mysterious genetic sequence. Using advanced CRISPR-based gene editing tools, they isolated the sequence from a survivor's DNA and activated it within a controlled in vitro culture of human cells. They were looking for any kind of protein expression, any biological function they could identify. What they got was something else. The moment the sequence was fully activated, the petri dish of human cells emitted a single, powerful and highly complex radio signal. It was a tight beam burst, lasting for only 72 seconds, containing a staggering amount of encoded data. It was a message. As the terrified technicians triangulated the signal's properties, they ran its core frequency and modulation against every astronomical database on Earth. They found a match. A perfect, undeniable match to a signal that had haunted radio astronomers for nearly 50 years. The frequency, the signal strength, the Doppler shift. It was identical to the unexplained WOW signal, a powerful, anomalous radio transmission detected by the Big Ear radio telescope in 1977, which was thought to have come from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. The revelation was absolute. The WOW signal was not a message sent to Earth from a distant star. It was a message sent from Earth. It was a homing beacon, a tripwire, buried in the human genome for millennia, designed to activate and broadcast a signal if its host cells were ever targeted by a specific type of advanced genetic technology. A technology like the Crimson Plague. The precursors had not just marked our ancestors, they had bugged them. The survivors were not saved because they were special. They were saved because they were the alarm system, and the Crimson Plague wasn't the true attack. It was just the event that finally, after 500,000 years of silence, rang the galactic dinner bell for something much, much older. Chapter 3. The horrifying revelation that humanity was not just a species, but a genetically tagged alarm system echoed only in the most secret and fortified bunkers on Earth. The chilling implication of the WOW signal, that our survival was merely a trigger for a much older conflict, was a mystery buried under the immediate overwhelming threat of the Crimson Plague. But to truly understand the nature of the enemy who had sprung this ancient trap, to comprehend the cold, strategic calculus that viewed our entire species as a resource, we must rewind the clock. We must go back to the hours immediately following the impossible shattering of Three-Eye Atlas, when the world was still reeling from the revelation that the comet was a fleet. We must turn our eyes from the impending biological nightmare on Earth to the direct, brutal, physical massacre that was already underway on Mars. Before the plague, before the psionic assault, Mars was humanity's foothold in the cosmos. It was a symbol of our future, a testament to our ambition. A population of just over 3,000 scientists, engineers and pioneers lived in a handful of fledgling colonies. The largest, Ares Prime, was a cluster of semi-subterranean, pressurized habitats nestled in the vast plains of Amazonis Planitia. Smaller outposts like Olympus Village clung to the slopes of the great volcano, and deep drilling operations searched for water ice and rare minerals in the northern polar regions. They were the most isolated and vulnerable people in human history, connected to their home world only by a thin stream of radio waves. It was these 3,000 souls who had the front row seat to the opening act of the invasion. They watched through their observatory telescopes as Three-Eye Atlas broke apart not into chunks of ice and rock, but into a swarm of geometrically perfect hostile craft. For them, the debate on Earth was a distant absurdity. They knew exactly what this was. The attack on Mars was not one of exotic energy beams or reality-bending physics. The alien fleet reserved those tactics for the far greater threat of Earth. For the fragile colonies on Mars, they chose a method of terrifying simplicity and overwhelming force. They used kinetics. From their positions in high Martian orbit, the attacking ships released a series of dense, teardrop-shaped projectiles. These were not missiles with complex guidance systems. They were, in essence, giant metal spears. They were modern-day rods from God. The principle is one of the most basic and brutal in physics. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. The alien projectiles, likely composed of an ultra-dense material like tungsten or a manufactured exotic element, had immense mass. Dropped from orbit, they were accelerated by Mars's gravitational pull, screaming through the planet's thin atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, reaching a terminal velocity of over 5 kilometers per second. The last panicked transmission from Commander Eva Rostova of Ares Prime captures the sheer, hopeless physics of the situation. Her voice, strained with a mixture of awe and terror, was broadcast across the solar system. This is Prime Station to any listening. The enemy fleet is deploying. Kinetics. We're tracking multiple inbound objects. Velocity is, dear God, it's Mach 15. They aren't explosive. Repeat, these are not warheads. They don't need to be. The energy yields, we're calculating impact energies in the range of 20 kilotons apiece. It's like being shot by a god. The impacts were not explosions in the way we understand them. There was no mushroom cloud, no lingering fireball. There was only a silent, blinding flash of pure white light as the projectile, carrying the energy of a small nuclear bomb, struck the rust-red regolith and vaporized instantaneously. The kinetic energy had to go somewhere. It was converted into a seismic shockwave of unimaginable violence and a superheated plasma pulse that flash-melted the surrounding landscape. The first rod struck 7 kilometers from Ares Prime. The ground bucked like a stormy sea. Commander Rostova's final, clipped words were, "Seismic wave inbound. The habitat is compromised. We're losing press." Then silence. The attack was a pattern of systematic, methodical sterilization. One by one, the kinetic rods rained down, striking not just the habitats themselves, but the critical infrastructure that supported them. The solar arrays were shattered into glittering dust. The water ice mining operations at the pole were obliterated, the impacts turning thousands of tons of ancient ice into a flash pan of atmospheric vapor. The fledgling atmospheric processors, humanity's first small step towards terraforming, were smashed back into their constituent atoms. The shock waves did what the direct impacts did not, racing through the planet's thin crust, causing catastrophic cave-ins in the underground sections of the colonies, rupturing the pressurized tunnels and domes miles away from the impact sites. Within the space of an hour, every single human outpost on Mars was annihilated. The most profound and lasting effect of the bombardment, however, was on the Martian landscape itself. The immense energy of the impacts, far greater than any volcanic eruption the planet had ever seen, melted the iron oxide-rich regolith. As the superheated ground rapidly cooled in the thin Martian air, it did not return to red sand and rock. It solidified into vast circular plains of smooth black, obsidian-like glass. From orbit, the attack looked like a disease spreading across the red planet, a series of dark, spreading lesions that consumed the familiar rust-coloured desert. They were turning Mars into a glass desert, systematically erasing the very geological signature of the world that was, and paving it over into something new, something alien. It was an act of planetary resurfacing, of wiping the slate clean with terrifying industrial efficiency. From the panicked perspective of NORAD and the newly formed United Space Force on Earth, this horrifying spectacle was a clear strategic message. First was the elimination of a potential fallback position. With Mars gone, humanity was trapped on Earth, with no lifeboat and no place to run. Second, it was a profound act of psychological warfare, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it was designed to break humanity's will to fight before the war for Earth even began. Finally, by sterilizing the planet of all terrestrial life and technology, the aliens were securing a forward operating base, a pristine staging ground for their primary assault on Earth. But it was the very last piece of data from Mars, a fragmented low-bandwidth signal from an automated deep-crust seismic sensor near the polar caps, that hinted at a purpose far stranger than anyone on Earth could have imagined. The automated sensor had survived the initial bombardment, buried kilometers beneath the surface. Its final report, transmitted hours after all human life on Mars had been extinguished, showed that the kinetic strikes had ceased. But the seismic activity had not. The alien ships had landed on the newly formed plains of black glass, and they had begun to drill. The seismic readings were not of impacts, but of massive rhythmic boring penetrating deep into the Martian crust at multiple coordinated locations. The final automated data packet was appended with a single chilling analysis tag generated by the sensor's own AI. Activity is consistent not with construction but with large-scale targeted excavation. They were not just clearing the surface to build a base. They were digging. They were looking for something. Something that they evidently knew was already there, buried deep beneath the sands of Mars. The final fragmented data packet from the last automated seismic sensor on Mars painted a picture that was, in its own way, as terrifying as the biological nightmare unfolding on Earth. The aliens were not just sterilizing the planet, they were excavating it. The rhythmic, powerful seismic readings were consistent with a massive, targeted drilling operation, a determined effort to reach something buried deep within the planet's crust. As analysts at a panicked jet propulsion laboratory and European Space Agency cross-referenced the drilling locations with their high-resolution geological maps, a chilling pattern emerged. The excavation was not random, nor was it targeting mineral deposits. All drilling was converging on a single infamous region, Cydonia Mensae. To the public, Cydonia was known for one thing, the so-called face on Mars, a geological formation that, under a specific combination of light and shadow in a low-resolution 1976 photograph, resembled a humanoid face. While science had long since dismissed this as a simple case of pareidolia, a trick of the light, the conspiracy had lingered for decades. Now, it seemed the conspiracy was not wrong, merely incomplete. The rock formation itself was not the point, it was a marker, a gravestone, and the aliens of 3i Atlas, with a certainty that could only come from an ancient star chart, had come to dig up the grave. Right now, on Thursday, September 25th, 2025, at precisely 9:30 in the morning, Central European summertime, the planet Mars is undergoing a fundamental transformation. As someone in New York, America, might be finishing their morning coffee or starting their workday, the aliens of 3i Atlas are unearthing a secret that has slept for eons, and in the process they are unmaking the world we thought we knew. While this colossal excavation was underway, the fleet deployed the second phase of its Martian campaign. This was not a weapon of force, but of chemistry. A squadron of large, specialized ships descended from orbit, not landing, but taking up positions deep within the thin Martian atmosphere. They were vast automated atmospheric processors. They began to ingest the planet's air, a tenuous mix composed of 95% carbon dioxide, on an unbelievable scale. At first, planetary scientists on Earth assumed this was the beginning of a terraforming process, a horrifyingly swift effort to make the planet habitable for the invaders. They were wrong. This was xenoforming. It was the systematic and deliberate engineering of an anti-human environment. An interview recorded with a frantic Dr. Lena Petrova, a leading astrobiologist, just before the global communications blackout laid out the process. "They're not making it breathable," she explained, her voice tight with panic. "They're making it toxic on a level we can't even comprehend. Our probes see them using a form of hyper-efficient cold catalysis to break down the carbon dioxide. They are jettisoning the carbon as a fine black aerosol, which is already starting to darken the planet's surface, drastically changing its albedo and causing surface temperatures to rise. But the oxygen, they are not releasing the oxygen. They are bonding it with another element they brought with them, something our spectrometers are identifying as a fluorine-sulfur hybrid compound. They are manufacturing on a planetary scale a new atmosphere of sulfuryl fluoride. Sulfuryl fluoride is a real gas, used on Earth as a fumigant to exterminate termites. It is colourless, odourless, and incredibly lethal to oxygen-breathing life. But the gas the aliens were creating was far denser and more reactive. It was a thick, corrosive smog that began to settle over the Martian plains, clinging to the ground like a toxic fog. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The newly formed black glass deserts began to etch and dissolve as the gas reacted with the silica. The polar ice caps, a mixture of water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, began to sublimate violently, not into breathable air, but into a chemical soup that would strip flesh from bone in seconds. Any surviving human technology, like the old Curiosity and Perseverance rovers, would have their metal bodies and sensitive instruments corroded into sludge in a matter of hours. The aliens were not just killing a planet, they were salting the Earth, poisoning the well, ensuring that no carbon-based lifeform from Earth could ever gain a foothold there again. They were changing the very locks on the door to Mars. It was against this backdrop of planetary chemical warfare that the great excavation at Cydonia reached its conclusion. After days of drilling, the ground bucked and split apart. A vast chasm opened, not from an impact, but as if a colossal elevator were rising from the planet's depths. From this chasm, an object of impossible scale and design was raised to the surface. It was not a city nor a buried spaceship. It was a single monolithic structure, dozens of kilometers in length, composed of a dark, crystalline material that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its geometry was wrong, filled with non-Euclidean angles and shapes that seemed to twist the eye and the mind. It hummed with a deep, resonant energy that could be felt even by the seismic sensors on the far side of the planet. And it was clearly not made by the aliens of 3i Atlas. Their ships, as advanced as they were, looked like crude industrial tools next to this majestic, ancient artifact. Its design was more organic, more elegant, more advanced by an order of magnitude. The analysts at JPL, in their last coordinated report before the global network failed, came to a staggering conclusion. The 3i Atlas aliens had not come to Mars to build a base. They had come to retrieve their technology, or, rather, the technology of their masters. This buried monolith was unmistakably a piece of precursor technology, the same impossibly ancient civilization that had seeded the human genome. Mars was not a dead world. It had been a vault, and the Atlas fleet was here to open it. The final act was swift. The alien ships surrounded the now surfaced monolith, attaching themselves to vast energy conduits that became visible along its surface. They began to pour their own power into the ancient machine, a process akin to jump-starting a dead god. For a full hour, the structure absorbed the energy, its internal hum rising in pitch until it became a silent, planet-wide scream on every radio frequency. Then it activated. From the structure's apex, a brilliant, coherent beam of pure energy erupted, slicing through the new, toxic atmosphere and into space. But the beam was not aimed at Earth. To the profound confusion and terror of the few astronomers still able to watch, it was aimed outward, away from the sun, a tight beam transmission directed towards the empty darkness in the direction of the constellation Hercules. It was not a weapon, it was a signal, a beacon, an announcement. In the final moments, as the systems on Earth began to fail, the strategic analysts understood the horrifying totality of the Martian campaign. The kinetic bombardment was to eliminate the current occupants. The xenoforming was to ensure the planet remained sterile for any future carbon-based life. The excavation was to retrieve and activate the prize, and the prize was a communication device. A galactic all-clear to announce that the pesky, intermittent signal from the human alarm system had been dealt with, and the package was secure. The last coherent thought transmitted from the JPL analysts before the network went dark was a simple, terrifying sentence. They're not the invaders, they're just the cleanup crew. They came to Mars to awaken a dormant weapon, and now it's signaling that the planet is ready for its true owner. Chapter 4. The signal from the awakened precursor artifact on Mars is, at this moment, slicing through the void, an ancient message finally sent after 1,000,000 years of silence. But its destination is light years away. It's meaning a problem for a future that humanity may no longer have. Because at this exact moment, 9:36 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late September 2025, the fate of every single person on Earth, including those going about their day in places like New York, America, is being decided 1.5 million kilometers away. It is being decided in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of the Lagrange point 1, the gravitationally stable perch between the Earth and the Sun. This is where humanity has drawn its final, desperate line in the sand. Lagrange point 1, or L1, has always been a place of quiet observation. It is the home of our most critical solar observatories and deep space weather satellites, a place where the gravitational pull of the Sun and the Earth cancel each other out, allowing an object to remain perfectly positioned. Today it is not a place of science, it is a battlefield. In the weeks following the shattering of 3I Atlas, every spacefaring nation on Earth, in a final unprecedented act of unity, moved its hidden military assets to this single strategic point. What humanity managed to assemble was the pinnacle of its martial technology, a fleet cobbled together from decades of black projects and secret orbital programs. This was not a fleet of elegant, crude starships. It was a cold, robotic, and brutalist collection of weapons platforms, commanded remotely from a bunker deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. At its core were the 12 Aegis-class destroyers, massive, unmanned scaffolds of armour and weaponry, driven by sophisticated combat AI. Surrounding them were the Thor-class platforms, essentially giant railguns designed to launch tungsten rods at unthinkable velocities. Further back, orbiting a repurposed International Space Station, were the Helios arrays, a series of colossal mirrors designed to focus gigawatts of laser energy across thousands of kilometers. And weaving between them all were swarms of thousands of small, agile drones, the wolves, designed to overwhelm an enemy with sheer numbers. This was everything humanity had. It was our shield, our sword, and our very last hope. From the command bunker, General Marcus Vance of the Unified United States Space Force watched the enemy approach on his tactical display. The larger portion of the 3I Atlas fleet, having left a detachment to oversee the mysterious operations on Mars, had executed a brutally fast burn towards Earth. Their ships, now visible to the fleet's sensors, were a nightmarish contrast to humanity's functional grey hardware. They were crystalline, almost organic structures that seemed to glide through the vacuum with no visible propulsion, their multifaceted hulls shimmering with a faint internal light. They were not so much machines as they were creatures. "They are in the engagement envelope," a synthesized voice announced in the bunker. General Vance did not hesitate. "Execute Alpha Strike. Fire everything." The human attack was a masterpiece of theoretical space combat, a layered volley designed to strike the enemy at every range with every weapon at their disposal. The first wave was long range, a volley of 100 nuclear-tipped interceptor missiles, their engines flaring bright against the black, accelerating towards the alien fleet. The second wave, unleashed moments later, was the Thor platforms. With a tremendous silent discharge of electromagnetic energy, they fired their kinetic rods. These were not the city killers that had struck Mars. They were smaller, ship-killer projectiles, but the railguns accelerated them to a blistering 1% of the speed of light. The final wave was the lasers. The Helios arrays pivoted, their mirrors focusing the sun's and their own internal power into beams of coherent light, painting the lead alien vessels with an intensity that could vaporize an aircraft carrier in seconds. The comms chatter from the battle AI was a calm, rapid stream of data. Nuclear volley on trajectory, kinetic volley on trajectory, laser arrays are painting primary targets, all systems optimal. Then, the human attack arrived, and it failed. It failed so completely, so utterly, that it broke every known model of space combat. The 100 nuclear missiles detonated simultaneously, creating a series of silent, expanding fireballs of pure plasma, a man-made constellation of temporary suns. But the alien ships passed through the fire unscathed. High-fidelity telemetry showed that it was not a shield. As the blast wave of radiation and energy washed over their hulls, the very fabric of space-time around the ship seemed to warp. The energy was shunted, bent around them in a perfect localized gravitational lens, leaving them untouched in a calm bubble of normal space. The kinetic rods, humanity's most powerful weapon, fared no better. The hypervelocity projectiles, which should have punched through any physical armor, were deflected. As they neared the alien ships, their trajectories were gently but irrevocably curved, as if they were passing a series of massive invisible planets. They flew wide, missing their targets by thousands of kilometers, to continue their journey into the void. Finally, the Helios array's powerful lasers, which had successfully locked onto the lead alien ship, seemed only to empower it. The crystalline hull of the vessel began to glow brighter, absorbing the gigawatts of energy, its internal light pulsing with a faster, more aggressive rhythm. We were not damaging them. We were feeding them. For a full 2 minutes, the alien fleet simply weathered the storm, absorbing or deflecting humanity's ultimate arsenal without any visible effort. Then, they returned fire, and in that single contemptuous counterattack, the war was effectively lost. One of the larger crescent-shaped alien vessels opened a circular aperture in its prow. It was not a gun barrel. It was a hole in reality, a patch of perfect, absolute blackness. From this aperture, a filament of something that was not light and not matter unspooled across space. It was a thread of pure void, an impossibly thin line of absolute entropy that moved at near light speed. This filament struck the Aegis destroyer Valiant. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no debris. The Valiant, a 500,000-ton war machine of armour and electronics, simply ceased to be. One moment it was there, and the next, the section of space it occupied was utterly empty. The filament had not destroyed it. It had erased it, unmaking its every atom, violating the conservation of mass and energy itself. Another filament lanced out, and another Aegis destroyer, the Triumph, vanished from existence. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, a stunned silence fell over the room of operators. Only the calm, synthesized voice of the battle AI broke the quiet as it analyzed the telemetry from the destroyer's final milliseconds. Analysis of the void filament's impact is complete. The weapon does not transmit kinetic, thermal, or electromagnetic energy. The target vessel experienced a localized, instantaneous, and total cascade failure of all quantum-level physical laws. All matter within the target area was immediately converted to maximum entropy. General, the enemy is not firing a weapon. They're firing a localized, weaponized law of physics. Specifically, they appear to be weaponizing the second law of thermodynamics. The AI paused, then delivered its final chilling conclusion. Recommended course of action. There is no recommended course of action. There is no defense against this. We are facing an enemy that can turn the universe itself into a weapon. The final, synthesized report from the battle AI echoed in the profound silence of the Cheyenne Mountain command bunker. We are facing an enemy that can turn the universe itself into a weapon. For the men and women watching the tactical display, this was not hyperbole. It was a statement of fact. They had witnessed their most powerful weapons, the culmination of a century of technological advancement, rendered utterly impotent. They had watched their destroyers, vessels that represented the pinnacle of human engineering, be not destroyed but deleted from reality. The war for space was not lost in a heroic, pitched battle. It was lost in a 10-minute lesson in humility, a brutal demonstration of the chasm between a species that has mastered force and a species that has mastered reality itself. At 9:37 in the morning, on a Thursday in America, the sky is still blue. People are still driving to work in New York. The illusion of normalcy holds, but that illusion is a lie, a temporary mirage sustained only by the speed of light. Because 1.5 million kilometers away, the sky has already fallen. The battle is over, and the enemy is coming. General Vance, faced with the certainty of total annihilation, made the only decision he could. He issued a single command to the surviving fleet AI, Winter Contingency. It was not an order to fight. It was an order to flee. The remaining Aegis platforms and Thor arrays, those that had not yet been erased, executed a desperate full-power burn, not towards the enemy, but away from Earth, towards the dark side of the moon. Their mission was no longer to defend, but to become time capsules, to hide in the lunar shadows and preserve a record of humanity's final moments. The swarms of wolf drones scattered, becoming a cloud of inert debris, hoping to be mistaken for micrometeoroids. Humanity's presence as a power in its own solar system was extinguished. The 3I Atlas fleet did not give chase. It treated the fleeing remnants of humanity's navy with the same contemptuous indifference it had shown their attack. As a factor too insignificant to warrant attention, the fleet executed a hard, fast burn, closing the distance to Earth in a matter of hours. Their arrival was not the slow, menacing descent so often imagined in fiction. It was a brutal, high-speed orbital insertion that filled the sky. From the ground, for the first time, humanity could see its enemy with the naked eye. They were not points of light. As they entered low Earth orbit, they resolved into vast, dark, geometric shapes that blotted out the stars, their silent passage across the heavens observed by billions of terrified people. What remained of Earth's conventional military power responded with a final, defiant roar. From silos across North America, Russia, and China, Hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, their warheads retargeted for suborbital intercepts, clawed their way into the sky. A new generation of scramjet-powered fighters ascended to the very edge of space, their pilots pushing their machines to the breaking point. It was the planet's last gasp, a volley of fire and steel aimed at the new, dark gods in the sky. It was a gesture of utter futility. The same space-time warping defences that had worked so flawlessly at L1 were even more effective within Earth's gravity well. The ICBMs screaming towards their targets at Mach 25 found their guidance systems failing, their trajectories bending away as they approached the alien ships. A squadron of advanced fighters launched a volley of hypersonic missiles, only to watch in horror as the projectiles were caught by a localized gravity well, spun around 180 degrees, and flung back at them, annihilating the entire squadron with its own ordnance. The aliens did not fire a single shot in return. They simply moved through our final desperate attack as a whale moves through a swarm of krill, utterly unconcerned. Then the landings began, and they were not what anyone expected. Small, teardrop-shaped vessels, perfectly black and impossibly fast, detached from the orbiting motherships. They entered the atmosphere without a sound. There was no sonic boom, no fiery re-entry trail. They wrapped themselves in their space-time bubbles, slicing through the air in perfect silence, invisible to radar. They did not target cities. They did not strike Washington, Beijing, or Brussels. They ignored military installations, power grids, and population centres. The first wave of landing craft set down, with pinpoint precision, in the centres of the world's largest, most remote, and most inhospitable deserts. A lone, terrified journalist, broadcasting on a satellite feed from the Atacama Desert in Chile, captured the first images. A sleek black vessel, half a kilometre long, rested silently on the arid plains. A ramp lowered, and from its dark interior emerged not soldiers, but something else. They were colossal, multi-limbed machines, part insect, part crustacean, part construction vehicle. These were not warriors, they were workers. They moved with an unnerving, industrial purpose, their bodies unfolding into massive drilling rigs, atmospheric condensers, and strange vibrating pylons that they began to drive deep into the desert floor. Within an hour, identical reports came in from the Gobi, the Sahara, the Australian outback, and the Kalahari. The aliens were not invading, they were deploying. The terrifying truth began to dawn on the analysts in the Cheyenne bunker. This was not a war, it was a construction project, and humanity was simply the local wildlife scuttling around the worksite. This phase of the plan was one of cold, planetary-scale engineering. The machines in the deserts began their work. They were ignoring us completely, their actions dictated by a logic that had nothing to do with human conflict. In the Cheyenne bunker, as General Vance and his team watched the satellite feeds, they could only try to understand the purpose of this global, synchronized activity. The pylons being erected in each desert began to activate, emitting a low, powerful, subsonic hum that could be felt as a vibration in the very rock of the continents. Global seismic sensors began to register a new, rhythmic pulse emanating from each landing site. The aliens were creating a network, a planetary grid of resonant frequencies. The AI, cross-referencing the pylons' energy signatures and their precise geographic locations, placed a new overlay on the main tactical display. The landing sites were not random at all. Each one was located at a key stress point on Earth's major tectonic plates. The pylons were not just broadcasting, they were synchronized. One by one, they began to send a powerful, focused pulse of energy not into the sky, but deep into the Earth's crust. It was not enough energy to trigger earthquakes or volcanoes, not a weapon in that sense. It was something far more sophisticated. The AI analyzed the complex waveform, comparing it to every known model of geophysics and planetary dynamics. It found a match. Its synthesized voice delivered the final, devastating report of the day. General, the resonant frequency of the alien grid. It is a perfect harmonic match for the convective flow of Earth's molten outer core. They're not trying to break the planet. They're creating a resonant circuit with the geodynamo itself. The AI paused, processing the implications. They're seizing direct control of our planet's magnetic field. Chapter 5. The final report from the battle AI in the Cheyenne Mountain bunker was a death sentence for the human race as a strategic power. With the ability to weaponize the fundamental laws of the universe, the aliens of 3i Atlas had rendered our entire concept of warfare obsolete. Their subsequent seizure of Earth's geodynamo was the final move in a planetary checkmate. Our planet's magnetic field, the invisible shield that had protected life for billions of years from the harsh radiation of space, was now in their hands. They controlled the very force that made our world habitable. At 9:43 in the morning in New York, America, the sun is shining. It feels warm, familiar, life-giving. But this is a lie. The sun has just been turned into a rifle aimed at our heads, and the aliens' fingers are on the trigger. They now control which parts of our planet will continue to live, and which parts will be sterilized by our own star. They demonstrated this power once and only once. With chilling precision, they lowered the magnetosphere over a 10,000 square kilometre patch of the remote South Pacific Ocean. Satellites that were not immediately fried by the onslaught of radiation transmitted horrifying data back to Earth. A focused, overwhelming stream of solar wind and cosmic rays, normally deflected by our shield, was allowed to hit the surface directly. The ocean in that region literally began to boil. It was a silent, terrifying display of absolute dominance. They could now hold every city on Earth hostage to the threat of solar immolation without firing a single conventional shot. Humanity was neutralized, not just defeated, but rendered utterly and completely irrelevant as a force. And with our species pinned under this threat, the true purpose of the invasion began. It was not conquest, it was not extermination for its own sake, it was harvesting. From the massive city-sized mothership still holding a high geostationary orbit, a new wave of vessels descended. These were not the sleek black landers that had deployed the desert pylons, nor were they the warships that had erased our fleet. These were colossal, ungainly industrial machines. They were tankers, processors, and mobile factories, their designs brutally functional. They ignored the land entirely and positioned themselves over the Earth's 5 great oceans. From the bellies of these hovering behemoths, vast structures began to descend into the upper atmosphere. The media remnants, in their last sputtering broadcasts, called them the ocean siphons. Each siphon was a structure of breathtaking scale, a kilometre-wide funnel held aloft by its own gravitational control field, connected to the tanker ship above by a shimmering, translucent tube that looked like a pillar of solid glass. The funnels plunged into the sea, creating whirlpools the size of hurricanes. But they were not simply pumping water. To do so would require an impossible amount of energy to fight Earth's gravity. The process was far more sophisticated and far more destructive. As seawater was drawn into the maw of the siphon, it passed through a powerful energy field that performed instantaneous, in-situ desalination. The brine and salt were ejected in massive, hypersalinated clouds that poisoned the surrounding ocean for thousands of square miles. The pure fresh water, however, was immediately subjected to a process of molecular-level electrolysis. It was split into its constituent hydrogen and oxygen. The aliens were not here for our water. They were here for the hydrogen locked within it, the most abundant and powerful fuel source in the universe. The dissociated oxygen was treated as a waste product, vented directly into the atmosphere, creating localized zones of hyperoxygenation that caused terrifying explosive firestorms in the clouds above. The ecological collapse was immediate, total, and global. The sheer volume of water being displaced and atomized created a wave of cascading disasters. The initial deployment of the siphons in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans created simultaneous mega tsunamis that scoured every coastline on the planet, wiping out coastal cities and salinating agricultural land for hundreds of miles inland. But this was just the first violent consequence. A more insidious and permanent change was underway. The global sea level was dropping, not by millimetres per year, as it had with climate change, but by feet per day. Within a week, the port of Rotterdam was a muddy floodplain. The canals of Venice were dry trenches. The Great Barrier Reef was a dying, exposed boneyard. This unprecedented water removal fundamentally and irrevocably broke the planet's climate systems. The delicate balance of temperature and salinity that drives the global ocean conveyor belt was shattered. The Gulf Stream, the current that brings warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, stalled and died in a matter of days. The effect was a violent, paradoxical swing in the climate. As Europe began to flash freeze, the Amazon rainforest, starved of the Atlantic moisture it depended on, began to dry out. Uncontrollable wildfires, feeding on the hyperoxygenated air, began to consume the lungs of the planet. Monsoon seasons failed across Asia, leading to immediate continent-wide famine. The planet's biosphere was being dismantled with the same terrifying efficiency as its military. The foundation of all life on Earth, the marine ecosystem, was the first to be erased. The siphons were indiscriminate, atomizing everything from the great blue whales to the microscopic plankton that produce half the world's oxygen. The base of the planetary food web was not just broken, it was annihilated. In a final desperate broadcast from a deep-sea research vessel, the famed marine biologist Dr. Aris Thorne, the twin brother of the CERN physicist who had first identified the London anomaly, gave humanity its eulogy. "You have to understand," he said, his voice hollow over a crackling radio, "the horror is in the impersonality. They're not boiling the oceans to be cruel. They're not killing the whales out of malice. It is, industrial. It is the action of a farmer clearing a field of its native weeds and insects to plant a crop. We are not their enemy. We are an environmental externality to be cleared away for the sake of a more efficient harvest." It was this impersonality that was the true terror. The aliens were not evil. They were busy. Humanity was a problem of infestation, not opposition. But for the last analysts in the Cheyenne bunker, this industrial motive didn't add up. The scale was wrong. Cross-referencing the volume of hydrogen being harvested with the estimated mass and number of the alien fleet, they arrived at a staggering conclusion. The amount of fuel the aliens were gathering was an order of magnitude greater than what would be required to move their fleet to 100 different star systems. It was a quantity of energy that was not logistical, but planetary. One young analyst, staring at the numbers, piecing together the Martian excavation, the genetic culling, the seizure of Earth's geodynamo, and now this incomprehensible fuel harvest, saw the terrifying final equation. Her voice was a bare whisper when she presented her finding to General Vance. "Sir, this isn't a refueling stop. This is a logistics operation of a completely different scale. They're gathering enough delta V to achieve planetary escape velocity." She paused, her own mind struggling to accept the words. "They're harvesting the fuel required to move a planet. They're preparing to move Mars." The analyst's whisper in the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, "They're preparing to move Mars," was the single most insane and terrifying sentence ever uttered in human history. Yet, it was the only conclusion that fit the data. At just before 9:45 in the morning in a quiet German town, a realization is solidifying in a bunker halfway across the world that rewrites the very definition of cosmic horror. It is 9:44 a.m., September 25th. The sun is shining on New York, and humanity has just understood that its extinction is merely the collateral damage of a planetary-scale moving operation. The ancient precursor monolith, unearthed from its tomb in Sidonia, was not a weapon or a simple communication device. It was an engine, a planetary propulsion system capable of generating a space-time wake that could shift a world from its orbit. The 3I Atlas fleet was not an invading army waking its sleeping god. They were a team of interstellar engineers, and they were preparing to turn on the ignition. This revelation, however, still left the ultimate question unanswered. Why? Why move a dead planet? Why this incomprehensible expenditure of energy? The answer came not from any human deduction, but from the aliens themselves. At the precise moment the ocean harvesting on Earth reached 75% completion, a 3I Atlas fleet, who we would now come to know by their true designation, finally communicated. The broadcast was not a negotiation, a demand, or a threat. It was a formal, dispassionate notice, transmitted on every conceivable frequency from radio to microwave, encoded in a simple universal mathematical language that the remnants of human science decoded in minutes. It was a legal document, a bill of sale. The document, which displayed on the main screen in the bunker under the header Deed of Transfer System Vel 458 Sol, was the most horrifying text ever read. It was a property deed for the fourth planet of our solar system, which it referred to as Sol 4. It detailed the transfer of ownership of this asset from a party identified only as the First Gardeners, a name that sent a chill through every analyst who remembered the precursor theories, to a civilization designated as the Cygnian hegemony. The date of the transaction was stamped in a unit of time that translated to roughly 700,000 of our years ago. The price paid for Mars was listed, but it was not in any currency we could understand. The entry read, "For the sum of 10 million kilotons of processed exotic matter and the full energy debt absolution of the captured singularity at Cygnus X1. It was the economics of gods, but it was the addendum to the deed, a small contractual clause at the bottom of the document that spelled out humanity's final pathetic place in the cosmos. Clause 7b of the transfer agreement stated, "The indigenous, pre-spacefaring, carbon-based fauna of the adjacent asset, Sol 3, are hereby designated as non-sentient biological resources, included in the sale as a source of raw hydrocarbons and hydrogen, for the purposes of fueling and activating the Sol 4 asset. The clearing of said bioresources is the contractual responsibility of the purchasing party." In that moment, the analysts in the bunker understood. The Crimson Plague was not a weapon of war. It was a pest control measure, legally sanctioned by a contract signed before our species could even speak. The ocean siphons were not an act of planetary vandalism. They were the fulfillment of a contractual obligation to refuel the engine. Our entire existence, our history, our art, our love, our wars, all of it was nothing more than a footnote in a cosmic real estate transaction. We were not the subjects of an invasion. We were the fuel for it. We were the weeds in a field that had just been sold to a new owner. This legalistic framework revealed the true nature of the Cygnian hegemony. They were not the godlike beings who had built the Mars engine. They were not the first gardeners who had traded planets like playing cards. They were a working-class industrial civilization, a blue-collar empire. They were the interstellar equivalent of a planetary moving company, a demolition crew that had been subcontracted to perform a job. Their biomechanical forms, which had seemed so terrifying, were now revealed for what they were. Perfect, living tools, adapted for large-scale, hazardous engineering projects. Their lack of malice, their utter indifference to our resistance was not the mark of superiority, but the mark of labourers on a job site. Arguing with them about the morality of our own extinction would be as futile and as absurd as a colony of ants protesting the construction of a new highway. We were not even speaking the same language of relevance. The true villains of our story, the true architects of our doom, were the first gardeners, the precursors, the ancient unknowable civilization that had viewed an entire solar system as their property, who had seeded our genome with a genetic tripwire, and who had then sold the neighbouring planet to an industrial conglomerate, throwing in its entire ecosystem as a rounding error in the final price. They were the cosmic landlords who had put a clause in our lease that allowed the new owners to burn the furniture for firewood. The harvesting of Earth's oceans was nearly complete. Global sea levels had dropped by over 400 feet, exposing continental shelves and turning the world's coastlines into vast, dead plains of mud and salt. The planet's climate was a chaotic, howling mess of superstorms and flash freezes. The Cygnian hegemony, having fulfilled its contractual obligation to gather the fuel, transmitted its second and final message to the dying world. It was an invoice. The document, which appeared on the bunker's screen, was titled Invoice for Services Rendered, Bioresource Clearing Sol 3. It listed, in cold numerical detail, the energy expenditure of deploying the Crimson Plague and the ocean siphons, and billed the now non-existent entity of human civilization for the work. It was a final, bureaucratic, and utterly insane insult, the cosmic equivalent of a murderer charging his victim for the price of the bullet. A junior analyst, staring in disbelief at the invoice, cross-referenced the total energy cost with the data still streaming in from the Mars engine. He saw the final piece of the puzzle, a truth even more expansive and horrifying than the moving of a single planet. He turned to General Vance, his face pale. "Sir, the bill of sale, I've reread the fine print. They didn't just buy Mars. The deed grants them salvage rights to all undeveloped assets in the system. The asteroid belt, the gas giant's moons, Jupiter's hydrogen. They're not just moving a planet." He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "This isn't a foreclosure on a single property. They bought the entire block. And this is just them starting the demolition." Chapter 6. To fully comprehend the contractual horror of the planetary harvest and the absolute futility of our military defiance, we must rewind the narrative. We must go back in time, before the fall of the sky, before the Red Plague, before the first drop of our world's oceans returned to fuel. We must return to the moment of Genesis, the instant the threat was born from the chrysalis of a lie that had been travelling between the stars for 1,000,000 years. We must witness the event that turned a celebrated astronomical curiosity into the harbinger of our extinction, the shattering of 3I Atlas. In the weeks leading up to the event, the world was in a state of scientific rapture. The third confirmed interstellar object was approaching its perihelion, its closest pass to the Sun. Every major telescope on and off the planet was trained on it. It was, by all initial appearances, a comet, albeit a strange one. Its trajectory was a perfect hyperbola, a clear indicator of its origin outside our solar system. Its coma, the fuzzy cloud of gas and dust sublimating from its surface, was larger than Jupiter, yet its nucleus was surprisingly small and dense. But the most anticipated event was its predicted fragmentation. Based on its trajectory and the intense gravitational and thermal stresses it was about to endure as it rounded the Sun, astronomers predicted it would break apart. This was not an unusual prediction. Cometary fragmentation is a common and well-understood phenomenon. The world had watched in 1994 as Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 was torn into more than 20 pieces by Jupiter's immense gravity, before those pieces slammed into the gas giant in a series of Earth-sized fireballs. More recently, in 2020, Comet C2019Y4, Atlas, for which our interstellar visitor was partly named, had fizzled out spectacularly, crumbling into a cloud of dust and ice on its journey sunward. This is what science expected from 3I Atlas. Dr. Miles Ingram, the head of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile, had become the public face of the event. In a global live-streamed press conference just hours before the predicted fragmentation, he explained what the world was about to see. "What we expect," he said, his voice filled with the calm excitement of a scientist on the verge of a great discovery, "is a messy, chaotic, but beautiful disintegration. The tidal forces from the Sun will stretch the comet's nucleus like a piece of taffy. Solar radiation will cause the volatile ices on its surface to erupt in jets of gas, further weakening its structural integrity. We'll likely see the nucleus break into a few large chunks, which will then crumble into smaller and smaller pieces, forming a string of pearls, a trail of debris that will continue along the comet's orbital path. It's a spectacular natural process that gives us a rare chance to peek inside a visitor from another star system." Humanity held its breath. Millions tuned into live feeds from telescopes, expecting to see a beautiful, chaotic act of cosmic nature. What they saw instead was a quiet, clean, and utterly impossible act of intelligent design. At the precise moment predicted by the orbital models, 3I Atlas did not begin to crumble, did not stretch or fizzle. For a single silent second, its coma of gas and dust was pulled inward as if the comet took a sharp breath. Then it detonated. It was not a fiery chemical explosion. It was a single brilliant flash of cold blue-white light, so intense that for a moment it was visible as a new star in the daylight sky on Earth. The flash was instantaneous and perfectly spherical. When it subsided, the single nucleus of 3I Atlas was gone. In its place was not a messy, chaotic string of pearls. In its place was a fleet. Computer systems at every observatory on the planet began to count the fragments, and the numbers they returned were the first note in a symphony of horror. The fragments were not of varying sizes. They were perfectly, mathematically identical. They were not jagged chunks of rock and ice. They were sleek, geometric shapes like sharpened arrowheads of a dark, crystalline material, and the number was not random. There were not dozens or hundreds. There were exactly 1,331, 11 cubed. The number was not a coincidence. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of a mind that saw the universe in terms of pure, cold mathematics. But the most terrifying moment was yet to come. A natural cometary fragmentation would see the debris continue to drift apart, spreading out along the original orbital path. The fragments of 3I Atlas did not drift. Seconds after the flash, each of the 1,331 objects ignited a faint bluish drive, a form of propulsion that produced no visible exhaust. With silent, terrifying precision, they began to move. They arrested their forward momentum, pivoted in perfect unison, and began to arrange themselves into a vast, three-dimensional, crystalline battle formation that spanned thousands of kilometers. The random, chaotic beauty of nature had been replaced by the rigid, terrifying order of intelligent, hostile design. The world watched in stunned, absolute silence. The live streams from observatories simply stayed on the image. The hosts and commentators struck dumb. In newsrooms, producers screamed for explanations that no one could provide. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, every screen lit up with threat warnings. The moment was a paradigm shift for the entire human race, a single shared intake of breath from 8 billion people as they collectively realized the truth. The visitor to our solar system was not a rock. It was a Trojan horse. It was a perfectly disguised, perfectly designed weapon system that had used the laws of celestial mechanics to deliver itself to our doorstep. Dr. Ingram, his face pale, his scientific excitement, replaced with a look of profound existential dread, was still live on the air. He leaned into his microphone, and his whispered words became the epitaph for the old world. It's not a comet, it's an egg, and it just hatched. Dr. Ingram's horrified whisper, "It's an egg, and it just hatched," became the defining sentence of a new and terrifying age for humanity. In the minutes that followed the shattering, a profound collective shock enveloped the planet. It was not just the confirmation of hostile intelligent life, but the nature of the revelation itself that paralyzed us. We had not been discovered. We had been deceived. The aliens had not arrived in a terrifying display of power. They had snuck into our home disguised as a piece of celestial scenery, a cosmic wolf in a comet's clothing. This act of cunning, this profound intellectual outmaneuvering, was in many ways more terrifying than the prospect of a simple, brutish invasion. It implied an enemy that saw us not as rivals, but as a species so fundamentally primitive that we could be fooled by the most basic of celestial disguises. For a full hour after its formation, the newly born fleet of 1,331 crystalline vessels did absolutely nothing. They held their perfect, menacing formation in the void, a silent, static testament to their power. This silence was its own form of warfare. It allowed the full, crushing weight of the new reality to settle upon the human psyche. There was no ultimatum, no declaration of war. There was only the silent, patient presence of an apex predator that knew its prey was trapped. This deliberate pause gave humanity's surviving scientific and military institutions their first and only opportunity to study their executioner up close. Every available sensor, from the deep space eyes of the James Webb Space Telescope to the classified military arrays in orbit, focused on the fleet. What they saw defied the known laws of biology, engineering, and physics. The high-resolution spectrometry of the ship's dark, arrowhead hulls returned an impossible result. They were not composed of metal alloys or ceramics. The readings were consistent with a vast single-crystal silicon-carbon lattice, a form of biomechanical material that was more akin to a beetle's shell or the trunk of a petrified tree than the hull of a spaceship. The horrifying implication was that the ships were not constructed in a factory. They were grown. The energy readings were even more baffling. The ships gave off no discernible heat signature. They were perfectly impossibly cold, existing in the vacuum at a temperature just fractions of a degree above absolute zero. This was a direct violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Any machine, any life form, must produce waste heat. The alien fleet produced none. Their energy source was not chemical, nuclear, or antimatter. It was something far more exotic, a process that was 100% efficient, perhaps drawing power directly from the quantum vacuum of space-time itself. There were no visible engines, no weapon ports, no sensor arrays, no windows, no seams. The entire hull of each vessel was a single, unbroken, molecularly perfect surface. The weapons they would later use, the void filaments that erased matter from existence, did not fire from a cannon. They emerged from the very fabric of the hull itself, a temporary, localized restructuring of the ship's own physical form. A frantic, encrypted teleconference between the world's leading scientific minds highlighted the depth of our incomprehension. Dr. Sharma, the geneticist from Geneva, argued that the fractal patterns on the hulls, unique to each ship like a fingerprint, were the result of a genetic code. These are creatures, she insisted. engineered life forms on a scale we cannot imagine, Dr. Thorne, the CERN physicist, countered with equal fervour. Life cannot violate thermodynamics, he argued. This is a post-technological civilization. They are not living beings, they're perfect machines, quantum computers that have shaped their physical form to suit their needs. The terrible truth was that both were likely right. The aliens had erased the line between biology and technology, becoming something for which we had no name. After an hour of this terrifying silent scrutiny, the fleet moved. The maneuver was not an attack. It was a statement. A demonstration of just how utterly outclassed humanity was. The entire formation, all 1,331 ships, accelerated simultaneously. There was no ramp-up, no gradual increase in speed. In one instant, they were stationary. In the next, they were moving at 10% of the speed of light. The formation, spanning thousands of kilometers, crossed the inner solar system in minutes. It performed a perfectly synchronized high-speed flyby of Venus, a gravitational slingshot of impossible grace and precision, before returning to its original position in the orbit of Mars. The entire journey took less than 30 minutes. In the Cheyenne bunker, the analysts and physicists could only stare in mute horror. The G-forces from such an instantaneous acceleration should have crushed the ships into dust, regardless of what they were made of. It was a direct violation of the law of inertia. The only plausible explanation was that the ships were not propelling themselves through space. They were using a drive that moved space itself, contracting space-time in front of them and expanding it behind, an application of Alcubierre's theoretical warp drive that humanity had not even begun to master. Furthermore, the maneuver was too perfect. Not a single ship varied in its velocity or position by even a millimeter. This was not a collection of individual ships with individual pilots. It was a single distributed entity, controlled by a single hive-mind consciousness. It was a swarm, and every ship was a claw on the same cosmic beast. Upon returning to their starting position, the swarm executed its first strategic action. With the same fluid, impossible precision, the formation split. Approximately 1/4 of the fleet, a force of over 300 vessels, broke away from the main body. This smaller group pivoted, their arrow-shaped hulls turning to face the red, dusty sphere of Mars. They held their position, a silent, menacing vanguard whose objective was a complete mystery. The main body of the fleet, a force now of nearly 1,000 warships, turned as one. Their dark, crystalline forms, which had been facing the sun, now oriented themselves towards the third planet, the small, blue-white marble teeming with life. From the perspective of General Vance in the bunker, the tactical display, which had just moments ago shown a single overwhelming threat, now showed two. One was a formidable fleet poised over Mars, its intentions unknown. The other, the Grand Armada, was now burning a direct high-speed intercept course for Earth. In that moment, he understood. This was not a simple invasion. It was a coordinated two-front war, with two different and completely incomprehensible objectives. His voice was grim as he spoke to his command staff. My God, they're splitting their forces. What in hell are they planning for Mars? And what in God's name is about to hit us? Chapter 7. The story of the Three-Eye Atlas invasion does not truly begin with the terrifying birth of a fleet, nor with the brutal erasure of our navy at Lagrange Point 1. It does not even begin with the first microscopic agent of the Crimson Plague settling in a human lung. The true story begins weeks earlier, in the quiet, sterile domes of remote mountaintop observatories and in the cluttered basements of amateur astronomers. It begins not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, unsettling whispers, anomalies that were dismissed, data points that were ignored, truths that were suppressed. This is the story of the first moment the mask began to slip, when a handful of people first peered beneath the comet's disguise and saw the monster hiding underneath. In the weeks before its perihelion, Three-Eye Atlas was the darling of the astronomical world. Every major observatory was dedicating time to it, primarily using spectroscopy to study the chemical composition of its vast coma. Spectroscopy is the science of decoding light. By breaking a celestial object's light into its constituent rainbow of colours, scientists can identify the specific chemical elements that are emitting or absorbing that light. It is the bedrock of modern astrophysics. The initial spectrographic readings of the comet's coma were fascinating, but not alarming. They showed the expected signatures of a typical long-period comet: vast quantities of water ice, frozen carbon dioxide, and an unusually high concentration of carbon monoxide, suggesting it had formed in a particularly cold region of its home star system. It was a beautiful natural object, a pristine messenger from another world. The first anomaly was an accident. Dr. Elena Petrova, a brilliant but notoriously stubborn astrophysicist at the Keck Observatory in Hawaii, was attempting to do the impossible: get a clean spectrographic reading of the comet's solid nucleus, hidden deep within the brilliant glare of its own coma. The project was considered a long shot, but Petrova was using an adaptive optics program to try and filter out the coma's light. For a week she got nothing but noise. Then, a stroke of cosmic luck. A powerful M-class solar flare erupted from the sun. A wave of high-energy protons and radiation washed across the inner solar system. When this wave hit 3I Atlas, it had a unique effect. For a few brief minutes, the solar radiation pressure blew back the comet's coma, like a gust of wind parting a curtain, momentarily exposing the nucleus to a direct, intense burst of solar energy. The nucleus flared in reflected sunlight, and Petrova's instruments caught it. It was a flash of data lasting only a few dozen seconds, but it was enough. When her program processed the spectrograph of that momentary reflection, the result was so impossible that the observatory's internal review board immediately flagged it as an instrument calibration error. The data showed the expected faint signatures of water ice and silicates on the surface, but beneath that, shining through with undeniable clarity, were a series of sharp, distinct absorption lines that had no business being there. They were the signatures of heavy, refined metals. Not just the iron and nickel one might find in a P-type asteroid, but tungsten, niobium, and a specific stable isotope of osmium that is not known to occur in nature. It was the chemical fingerprint of a high-temperature, manufactured alloy, the kind of material one would expect to find in the heart of a nuclear reactor or the armour of a warship. Petrova fought for her data. She ran every diagnostic, recalibrated the entire instrument, and the result remained the same. The nucleus of the comet was a metallic sphere, thousands of meters in diameter, with a thin candy coating of ice and rock to make it look the part. Her conclusion was stark and terrifying. 3I Atlas was not a comet. It was an artifact deliberately disguised as one, but her paper was rejected. The scientific community, steeped in a tradition of conservative skepticism, found the conclusion too fantastic. It was easier to believe in a 1 in a billion instrument error than a 1 in a trillion alien deception. Her discovery, the first hard proof of the invasion, was buried under peer review. At the same time, another whisper was being heard by a very different community. All over the world, amateur radio astronomers, hobbyists and enthusiasts with large backyard dishes had also pointed their instruments at the inbound comet. While the professionals focused on light, the amateurs listened for radio waves. A small collaborative group of these enthusiasts, connected via online forums, noticed a strange signal. It was incredibly faint, buried deep in the chaotic radio noise generated by the comet's plasma tail interacting with the solar wind. Using their combined computing power to filter out the natural noise, they isolated a repeating structured signal. It was not a language. It was not a greeting. It was a complex repeating burst of pulses, a monotonous stream of data that was more like a machine's diagnostic check than a message. It was a steady rhythmic pulse that users in the forum began to call the heartbeat. It was the unmistakable sound of a vast, complex machine in a state of low-power hibernation, a silent, sleeping giant. Like Petrova, the amateur group tried to bring their findings to the professional community, and like her, they were dismissed. The natural magneto-hydrodynamic effects around a comet could produce all kinds of strange radio signals, they were told. It was interesting, but it was just noise. But one of the amateur leads, a retired signals intelligence analyst, refused to let it go. He found Petrova's rejected paper on a university server and saw the connection immediately. He contacted her, sending her the clean, filtered audio of the heartbeat signal. In her office in Hawaii, Petrova put the two pieces of the puzzle together: her own irrefutable proof of a manufactured metallic core and the amateur's undeniable evidence of an artificial mechanical signal. The comet was a machine, and it was alive. Together, they compiled their data into a single devastating paper and bypassing the traditional journals, uploaded it directly to the public preprint server, Arxiv. For a few hours, it was there for the world to see. Then it vanished. The paper was scrubbed from the server, and every mirror of it was taken down. Dr. Petrova received a visit from two quiet, unassuming men from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The lead amateur analyst was visited by a similar pair from the National Security Agency. They were not threatened, but they were informed in no uncertain terms that their research was now a matter of the highest national security, and they were legally bound by patriotism and by law to remain absolutely silent. A small, secret circle within the world's intelligence agencies now knew. They knew the object approaching was not a comet. They knew it was artificial, but they made a decision. To reveal the truth would cause global panic on an unprecedented scale. It could shatter the world economy, trigger wars, and collapse society, all for something that might just be a harmless ancient probe that would fly by without incident. They chose to suppress the truth. They chose to hope for the best. In her office, under a strict gag order, Elena Petrova watched the global news feeds celebrating the beautiful, harmless visitor from another star. She knew what was hiding beneath the ice. She knew it was a machine, and she knew, thanks to the amateurs, that it was broadcasting a heartbeat. She was one of a handful of people on the planet who knew the truth of what was coming, and the only thing she was allowed to do was watch. The official suppression of Dr. Petrova's findings and the silencing of the amateur astronomers who had detected the heartbeat was not an act of disbelief. It was an act of fear. A small, deeply compartmentalized sector of the global intelligence community, operating in the shadows of public science, had come to the same conclusion as Petrova. 3I Atlas was artificial. They knew. But their decision to enforce silence was not born of a desire to prevent panic, but from a chilling precedent set 8 years earlier. The reason they knew with such certainty what 3I Atlas was is because they believed they had seen its precursor. To understand their actions, we must look back at the first interstellar visitor, the object that opened the door for this invasion, a mystery known as Wandet Oumuamua. This context was laid bare in a classified memo, leaked in the final chaotic days from the office of a deputy director at the National Security Agency. The document, titled A Failure of Imagination, the Oumuamua Precedent and Event Chimera, reframes the 2017 discovery from a scientific curiosity into the single greatest intelligence failure in human history. The memo methodically builds its case, layering the public scientific anomalies of Oumuamua with classified data that had been hidden for years. It begins with the official story, the surface-level explanation of Oumuamua. It was the first object ever detected passing through our solar system that was confirmed to have come from another star. It was detected late, already on its way out, and was only observed for 11 days before it became too faint to see. The mainstream scientific consensus eventually settled on it being a natural object, perhaps a nitrogen iceberg fragment knocked off a distant exopluto, or a highly unusual comet made of solid hydrogen. These explanations were attempts to account for its single most baffling characteristic, its non-gravitational acceleration. The object was speeding up as it left the solar system, pushed by a force that was not gravity. But unlike a comet, it had no visible tail, no coma, no outgassing of gas and dust to explain this push. From there, the memo details the inconsistencies and anomalies, the data points that never quite fit the natural explanation. It lists them with cold precision. Its shape, inferred from the radical shifts in its brightness, was extreme. It was not a sphere like an asteroid, but something with a length-to-width ratio of at least 10 to 1, making it either cigar-shaped or, as later analysis suggested, perfectly flat, like a pancake or a solar sail. It tumbled through space chaotically, yet its trajectory was stable. Its surface, while dark and reddish, was also more reflective than a typical comet, hinting at a composition that was not just rock and ice. Each of these data points, while strange, could potentially be explained away by a sufficiently exotic natural origin. But taken together, they painted a picture of an object that did not behave like anything nature had ever been observed to produce. The memo then introduces the work of Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, the most prominent and vocal proponent of the artificial origin hypothesis. Loeb argued in a series of controversial but rigorously argued papers that Oumuamua's characteristics were entirely consistent with what one would expect from an extraterrestrial probe propelled by a solar sail. Its flatness, its lack of outgassing, and most importantly its acceleration being perfectly explained by the pressure of solar radiation, all pointed towards a deliberate, manufactured object. The memo notes that Loeb was widely criticised by his peers for this speculation. This section of the document is a perfect example of the story's core principle, using fringe ideas but anchoring them to real research and data. Then comes the major plot twist. The NSA document reveals what Loeb could not have known. It contains telemetry data from a classified spy satellite, one of the NRO's Keyhole series, which had been secretly retasked to observe Oumuamua as it passed Earth. The data is presented in a stark graph. As the object made its closest pass to our planet, it executed a tiny, almost imperceptible course correction. It was not a large burn, but a minute, precise maneuver, a fractional change in its trajectory that was statistically impossible for a natural, tumbling object. It was the unmistakable signature of an intelligent system making a final, minute adjustment. This single piece of hidden data changed everything. It confirmed the intelligence community's deepest fear. Oumuamua was not a random visitor. It was a scout, a probe. It had entered our system, surveyed the planets, made a close pass of the third one to observe its biosphere and technological signals, and then fired its drive to accelerate on its way, presumably to report its findings. The scientific debate was a farce. The government already knew the truth. The final section of the memo connects this precedent directly to 3I Atlas. It shows that the incoming trajectory of 3I Atlas, while not identical, shared a similar high orbital inclination to Oumuamua, suggesting an origin in the same general direction of the star Vega. The conclusion was inescapable. Oumuamua was the scout that had performed the initial reconnaissance and reported back that our system was a viable target. 3I Atlas, the object that had disguised itself as a comet, was the main invasion force that had followed the scout's path. The 8 years between the two visitations was the time it took for the message to get back and for the Armada to arrive. The memo concludes with a chilling, self-indicting summary, written by the NSA's own deputy director, a final hook that reframes the entire narrative. The scientific community's failure to recognise Oumuamua for what it was will be remembered as the single greatest intelligence failure in human history. We had 8 years of warning. We spent them debating the chemical composition of nitrogen icebergs, while the enemy was already on its way. The Hawaiians named Oumuamua the messenger from afar. We now know the message it carried was a target designation, and the army it summoned is at our door. Chapter 8. The suppressed secrets of Oumuamua and the quiet, ignored whispers from 3I Atlas were the prologue to our end, a story known only to a handful of silent scientists and paranoid spies. For the rest of the world, for the 8 billion people living their lives in a state of blissful ignorance, the end began at 0700 Greenwich Mean Time. It began the moment the single brilliant flash of the shattering was observed by every daylight-facing telescope on the planet. It began the moment the live feeds from Mars, which were supposed to be showing a celebratory stream of a close cometary pass, instead began broadcasting a massacre. This chapter is the story of the next 24 hours. It is the story of the day the abstract, distant threat in the sky became a concrete, immediate, and planet-ending reality. It is the story of the day the sky fell. The first casualty was the truth. In the initial hour following the birth of the alien fleet, governments and official media outlets around the world attempted to control the narrative. They spoke of an unprecedented astronomical event. They urged calm. They promised further analysis. But this was an apocalypse in the information age. Their measured, calming tones were drowned out by the raw, undeniable evidence being streamed directly from the Red Planet. News networks, in a decision that both informed and terrified the world, began broadcasting the raw, unedited feeds from ESA and NASA's Mars orbiters. The world watched, live and in high definition, as the first kinetic rods struck the surface. They saw the flash, the expanding dust clouds, the silent, brutal erasure of the Ares Prime colony. Social media became a planetary nervous system, firing in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. The hashtag #RedPlanetMassacre trended globally in under 10 minutes. TikTok and YouTube were flooded with videos taken by amateur astronomers, shaky, terrifying footage of the new fleet holding its perfect formation. People began posting videos simply looking up at the sky, pointing out the new, impossibly bright star that was the alien armada, visible even in the daytime. The carefully constructed edifice of official information, the trust in governments and experts evaporated in a single morning. The old world of top-down information was dead, replaced by a new reality of decentralized, crowdsourced terror. The second casualty was the global economy. At the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 10,000 points in the first 90 seconds, triggering every circuit breaker and forcing a market shutdown. The same story repeated in London, Tokyo, and Shanghai. The global financial system, a structure built entirely on a shared belief in the future, ceased to exist the moment the future itself was cancelled. Digital currencies became worthless as power grids flickered. The price of gold became irrelevant when the only things that mattered were canned food, clean water, and ammunition. The concept of wealth, of savings, of retirement, all of it became a bitter joke in the space of a single hour. Then came the third and most important casualty, social order. The collapse was not instantaneous and violent, not everywhere. It was at first a quiet and deeply personal unravelling. It was the millions of people who simply stood up from their desks at work and walked out, without a word. It was the traffic jams that stretched for hundreds of miles as people attempted a mass, uncoordinated exodus from the cities, a futile flight from an enemy that was in the sky above every city at once. It was the empty shelves into every grocery store, stripped bare in a matter of hours. It was the long, silent queues outside gun shops. It was the profound, terrifying realization in the mind of every individual that the rules that had governed their entire lives, the laws, the social contracts, the simple expectation of a tomorrow, were now null and void. The enemy was in the heavens, but the threat was now in the face of every stranger you passed on the street. While the world was disintegrating from the bottom up, its leaders were paralyzed in their bunkers from the top down. In the White House Situation Room, the Kremlin, and the Politburo Standing Committee in Beijing, the leaders of the world's great powers watched the same feeds as their citizens, their faces pale with the same impotent horror. They had been stripped of their power in a single stroke. Their nuclear arsenals were useless. Their armies were grounded, their economies were gone. A frantic attempt was made to form a unified planetary defense council, but even in the face of total extinction, the old suspicions and rivalries flared. The trust required for a global response had been eroded over decades, and it could not be rebuilt in a matter of hours. It was into this power vacuum, into this moment of maximum global paralysis, that the new threat emerged. As General Vance and the remnants of the US government watched the last of their space-based assets get erased at L1, an incoming message appeared on their screens. It was not from the aliens, it was a highly encrypted terrestrial signal originating from multiple untraceable points on every continent simultaneously. The message was decoded in seconds. It was a simple text in every major language. It read, "The day of purification is at hand. The harbingers are not your enemy, they are your salvation. The sins of this world will be burned away and the worthy will be granted a place in the new one. Cease all resistance. Only then can you be judged." The message was from a group no intelligence agency had ever heard of, but it was clear they were organised, well-funded, and technologically sophisticated. The enemy was not just the silent, terrifying fleet in the sky. The enemy was also here, on the ground, a fanatical fifth column of human beings who were not fighting the invasion, but actively welcoming it. The shocking discovery was that this was not just a war. It was a rapture, and a significant portion of humanity was praying for the end. The message from the self-proclaimed Children of the Harbinger was a psychological atom bomb dropped into the heart of humanity's last command centres. It was a shocking discovery that fundamentally and irrevocably changed the nature of the conflict. The enemy was not just an overwhelming external force in the sky, it was an internal human cancer, a fifth column that had been growing in the shadows, waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by a frantic scramble as intelligence agencies, what was left of them, were tasked with a single desperate objective: unmask this enemy within. What they found was more terrifying than any alien fleet. Using the last of their data mining capabilities, NSA and GCHQ analysts discovered that the Children of the Harbinger were not a new, opportunistic doomsday cult that had sprung up in the chaos. They were a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated, and terrifyingly patient global organization. Their digital signature, once they knew what to look for, was everywhere, woven through the fabric of society like a poison thread. This was a conspiracy of staggering breadth, and its members were not the fringe lunatics one might expect. Their ranks were filled with the elite: Nobel laureate scientists, four-star generals, Silicon Valley billionaires, and high-ranking government officials. They were the very people who had been entrusted with the planet's defense and future. Intercepted and rapidly decoded manifestos revealed the cult's chillingly coherent ideology. They did not worship the aliens as gods in a traditional sense. They viewed them with a kind of cold biological reverence, as a necessary and natural force. They believed that humanity was a failed experiment, a planetary cancer whose metastasis of consumption, war, and pollution was about to be cut out by a cosmic immune system. The aliens, the Harbingers, were not an invading force to be feared, but a cleansing fire to be welcomed. This was not an invasion, in their eyes. It was a planetary-scale chemotherapy, and their sacred duty was to hold the patient down while the cure was administered. It was a perfect dark fusion of conspiracy and nihilism, an ancient alien's belief system stripped of all its wonder and replaced with a cold intellectual desire for annihilation. But the central mystery remained. How could such a group have formed? How could they have known the Harbingers were coming? The answer lay buried in the very signal that the amateur astronomers had first detected. The faint, rhythmic heartbeat of 3i Atlas, dismissed by the mainstream as natural radio noise, was far more than a machine's telemetry. It was a complex, low-bandwidth, psionic broadcast. For years, as it travelled through the interstellar void towards our system, it had been transmitting its gospel. It was a signal that subtly influenced receptive minds, a seed of nihilistic logic that preyed upon those already disillusioned with humanity. The powerful, the intelligent, the arrogant. It nurtured a philosophy of failure and the aesthetic appeal of a grand cleansing finale. The cult was not recruited. It was cultivated, grown from the seeds of our own despair, watered by a whisper from the void. With this horrifying realization, a series of recent, seemingly unconnected events were suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. These were not failures or coincidences. They were deliberate, coordinated acts of sabotage, a campaign to ensure humanity was blind, divided, and weak when the Harbingers arrived. Analysts now understood that the reason Dr. Petrova's research on the comet's artificial nature was so easily and thoroughly suppressed was that two of the most senior members on the Astronomical Peer Review Board were children of the Harbinger. They had buried the single most important discovery in human history to protect their master's disguise. The military failure at Lagrange Point 1 was also re-examined. A deep diagnostic of the Battle AI's logs revealed that a critical software update to the targeting systems of the Thor railgun platforms had been inexplicably corrupted just hours before the battle. The hypervelocity projectiles, our best and only real weapon, had been firing with a microsecond-level timing error, enough to make them miss. The error was traced back to a single programmer at the United Space Force, a quiet, brilliant man who had taken his own life the morning of the invasion, a final act of a loyal martyr. Even the public's passivity was a manufactured product. The coordinated bot networks that had flooded social media with calming, dismissive narratives about the beautiful light show of the approaching comet were found to be funded by a shell corporation owned by a celebrated tech billionaire, a known philanthropist who was, in fact, one of the cult's highest-ranking members. Our every defense, scientific, military, and societal had been systematically dismantled from the inside out. The final psychological horror of this revelation settled upon the survivors in the command bunkers. The war was not just unwinnable, it had been rigged from the start. The enemy was not just the alien at the gate, it was the trusted colleague, the brilliant subordinate, the lifelong friend. Paranoia became the new oxygen. every decision was questioned, every advisor suspect. In the Cheyenne Mountain Command Center, General Vance was attempting to coordinate a last-ditch effort to secure nuclear launch sites with a handful of loyalist units. He turned to give an order to his chief of staff, a man he'd served with for 30 years, a man who was the godfather to his children. As his friend turned, the cuff of his uniform sleeve shifted, revealing a small, intricate tattoo on his wrist that Vance had never seen before. It was a complex geometric pattern of interlocking lines. With a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty, Vance recognised it. It was the same impossible fractal pattern that the Shard in London had dissolved into. The cult was not a shadowy they. It was us. The enemy was in the room. Chapter 9. The Interstellar Bullet. To understand the full, horrifying depth of the deception that led to our end, we must take one final journey back in time. Before the cults, before the panic, before the moment the sky fell, before even the first quiet whispers of doubt, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated scientific wonder. The story of our extinction begins ironically with what was celebrated as one of the greatest astronomical discoveries of the 21st century. It begins with the detection of the object that would come to be known as 3I Atlas. This chapter is the story of that discovery, a calm, scientific account of the day we first laid eyes on our destroyer and mistook it for a gift from the stars. To grasp the significance of the discovery, one must first understand what an interstellar object is. For nearly all of human history, every object we observed in the sky, planets, asteroids, comets, was a member of our own solar system gravitationally bound to our sun. They travel in closed loops, in ellipses. An interstellar object is different. It is a wanderer, a traveller from another star system that is moving so fast it slices through our solar system on a one-way trip. Its path is not a closed ellipse, but an open curve, a hyperbola. It is, in essence, an interstellar bullet, fired from a distant star millions of years ago, and we have only a brief window to observe it as it flies past. For centuries, these objects were purely theoretical. Then, in 2017, everything changed. The Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii detected a faint, fast-moving object on a bizarre trajectory. It was designated 1 Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar visitor. As we've discussed, Oumuamua was an anomaly that defied easy explanation, sparking a fierce scientific debate that lingers to this day. Then, just 2 years later, in 2019, a Crimean amateur astronomer named Gennady Borisov discovered the second visitor, 2I/Borisov. Unlike its predecessor, Borisov looked and behaved exactly like a conventional comet. It had a vast visible coma and a long, dusty tail. It was a reassuring discovery, proof that normal, natural comets are indeed ejected from their home systems and wander the galaxy. It became the textbook example of what an interstellar comet should look like. These two discoveries set the stage, creating a scientific baseline of expectation. Interstellar visitors could be strange, anomalous objects like Oumuamua, or they could be comfortingly normal, like Borisov. The discovery of 3I Atlas was a triumph of 21st century technology. It was found not by a human eye, but by the artificial intelligence algorithms of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile. This next-generation facility is designed to scan the entire visible sky every few nights, a colossal digital eye searching for anything that moves or changes. The AI flagged a faint, rapidly moving object with an extreme hyperbolic excess velocity, a speed so great it could only have come from the depths of interstellar space. The astronomical community exploded with excitement. It was only the third such object ever found, and it was the best one yet. Unlike Oumuamua, which was detected on its way out, 3I Atlas was spotted on its inbound journey, giving scientists months to prepare for its close approach. And unlike the faint, mysterious Oumuamua, this new visitor was behaving like a spectacular version of 2I/Borisov. Early observations revealed a massive, brilliant coma, far more active than any comet in our own solar system. It was a perfect specimen, a pristine piece of another solar system delivered directly to our doorstep. The naming committee designated it 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object. The name was a nod to the C2019Y4 Atlas comet, which had famously disintegrated, and it was chosen with a sense of hopeful irony. a belief that this new, robust visitor would survive its journey through our system intact. The deception was perfect. The aliens had clearly observed our reaction to the first two visitors. They understood that the mystery of Oumuamua had put us on edge, while the normality of Borisov had reassured us. So, they designed their Trojan horse not as a strange anomaly that would invite suspicion, but as the perfect, most beautiful example of a natural comet we could ever hope to find. It was a disguise designed to be celebrated, not feared. And celebrated it was. In the weeks that followed its discovery, 3I at last became a global phenomenon. It was a rare moment of unity, a shared sense of cosmic wonder. Schools organised nighttime observation parties. The media ran hopeful, inspiring stories about the secrets it might hold about life elsewhere in the universe. It was a beautiful, brilliant light in the darkness, a symbol of connection to the wider cosmos. This period of global celebration was the final, quiet lull before the storm. It was the last moment of innocence for a species that was staring its own doom directly in the face and seeing only beauty. From a small observatory dome in the high Atacama Desert, a young, brilliant astronomer captures the first high-resolution image of the comet's nucleus, a stunning picture of a bright, star-like point of light wrapped in a magnificent, swirling green coma. She is filled with a sense of profound, almost spiritual awe, the feeling of being the first human to ever truly see this visitor from another world in detail. She saw it as a messenger of cosmic wonder, a bridge between star systems. She had no way of knowing that the message it carried was a death sentence, and the only thing it was bridging was the gap between our world and the one that was coming to consume it. A trajectory of intent, the celebration of 3I. Atlas's discovery, born from its beautiful and deceptively normal appearance, was a global phenomenon. But while the world looked at the pictures, a small, dedicated team of scientists was looking at the numbers. In the sterile, quiet server rooms of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, the orbital mechanics team was tasked with the crucial job of refining the object's trajectory. Their work was not to admire the comet, but to predict its precise path through our solar system. It was in their cold, hard data, in the elegant and unforgiving language of mathematics, that the second great anomaly, the final, ignored warning, would be found. The first hint that something was wrong was the trajectory's perfection. Interstellar space is not empty. It is a chaotic sea of gravitational influences. Over the millions of years an object like 3I Atlas would have spent travelling between the stars, its path should have been subtly nudged and jostled by countless star systems, nebulae, and rogue planets. Its final trajectory into our solar system should have been, for lack of a better word, messy, a random vector from the galactic chaos. But the path of 3I Atlas was not messy. It was clean, precise, and alarmingly well aimed. To understand the impossibility of this path, one must first understand the science of gravitational assists. This manoeuvre, often called a slingshot, is a cornerstone of interplanetary travel for our own probes, like the Voyager spacecraft. A probe will fly close to a massive planet like Jupiter, using the planet's gravity to bend its course and steal a tiny amount of the planet's orbital energy to dramatically increase its own speed. It is a manoeuvre that requires breathtaking precision and planning. A natural, random object can, of course, have its trajectory altered by a planet. But the orbital mechanics team discovered that the trajectory of 3I Atlas was not just being randomly altered by Jupiter. It was a flight path that was optimized to use Jupiter for a complex and multi-stage manoeuvre. The team's projections, run on some of the most powerful supercomputers on the planet, revealed two impossibilities. First, the trajectory was using a Jupiter gravity assist not primarily to accelerate, but to decelerate. The object was executing a maneuver known as a gravity brake, shedding just enough of its immense interstellar velocity to achieve a long, slow, and stable encounter with the inner solar system. A natural object beholden only to gravity would have flown by at its maximum possible speed, giving us only a brief window for observation. 3I Atlas was deliberately slowing down to get a better look. Second, and far more damning, the gravity assist was also performing a perfect plane change, altering the object's inclination, the tilt of its orbit, to place it on a direct, mathematically perfect intercept course with the orbital path of Mars, an encounter that would occur months later. The chief of the orbital mechanics team, A cautious veteran scientist named Dr. Ben Carter ran the numbers 100 times. The odds of a random natural object possessing the exact initial velocity and approach angle to execute such a perfect two-part maneuver by chance were not just astronomical, they were functionally zero. It was the celestial equivalent of a random person throwing a paper airplane from a skyscraper in New York and having it glide perfectly through the mail slot of a specific apartment in Tokyo. Dr. Carter and his team presented their findings at an internal observatory review. Like Dr. Petrova's spectrographic data before them, their conclusions were met with deep skepticism and outright disbelief. The review board argued that Carter was committing the cardinal sin of science, anthropomorphism. He was seeing intention where there was only physics. The universe is a vast and ancient place, they argued, and given enough time and enough objects, even a 1 in a trillion trajectory is bound to happen eventually. To suggest the object was being intelligently guided was a fantastic leap, a violation of Occam's razor. Carter's report, with its stark conclusion that the trajectory was indistinguishable from a deliberately planned powered flight path, was officially rejected, flagged as being too speculative and lacking sufficient evidence to rule out a natural, albeit highly improbable, origin. The scientific community, in its demand for irrefutable proof, had blinded itself to the terrifying implications of the evidence it already had. Carter's findings, however, did not go entirely unnoticed. His rejected report was flagged by an algorithm that monitors scientific publications for keywords related to national security. The data was quietly passed from the academic world to the military one. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, analysts for the United States Space Force ran Carter's orbital data through their own far more powerful classified tracking systems designed to track hostile ballistic missiles, not comets. These systems not only confirmed Carter's analysis of the Jupiter gravity assist, but they found something he never could have: the smoking gun. Deep space telemetry revealed a series of minute, almost undetectable thermal blooms emanating from the object's nucleus at regular intervals. They were tiny course corrections, small engine burns happening in the deep void between planets, far from any gravitational influence. They were not the random, chaotic outgassing of a comet's jets. They were the precise, calculated, and undeniable signature of an active propulsion system. The final, secret briefing was delivered to General Vance in the lowest level of the bunker, months before the shattering. The presentation concluded with a single, horrifying animated map. It showed the trajectory of 3I Atlas, not as a passive natural curve, but as a series of calculated maneuvers. The initial deceleration burn in deep space, the precision gravity break at Jupiter, the plane change towards Mars, and the small continuous corrections of an active guidance system. The general stared at the map, at the clean, perfect line of the object's approach, a line that now terminated in a flashing red circle over the planet Earth. He looked at the analyst. "So it's not a bullet," he said, his voice grim. "It's a guided missile, and it seems its final target is us." Chapter 10. The Final Message. The story of humanity's war against the visitors from 3I Atlas ends not in a blaze of heroic, defiant glory, but in the suffocating silence of a concrete tomb deep beneath a mountain in Colorado. The harvest of Earth is complete. The oceans have been reduced to shallow, hypersaline basins. The atmosphere is a chaotic, broken mess. The vast majority of the human race has been converted into the living, crystalline infrastructure of an alien industry. On the surface, the children of the Harbinger act as wardens, overseeing the few remaining pockets of untransformed survivors, their faith having been rewarded with the position of trustees in a planetary graveyard. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the last bastion of the old world is about to fall. The final conflict is not against an alien creature, but a human one. General Vance and the handful of soldiers still loyal to him are in a standoff with the cultists, who have revealed themselves within the command staff. The war for the planet has been lost for weeks. This is the final, pathetic battle for a bunker. It is a conflict born of the ultimate betrayal, the last spasm of a species that has been defeated both from without and from within. It is at this moment, as the two sides are about to open fire on each other, that the Cygnian hegemony transmits its final message. This is not a broadcast of text or audio, it is a direct psionic data burst, using the same technology that had cultivated the cult for years, but amplified 1,000-fold. The message bypasses the senses and is injected directly into the consciousness of every remaining human mind on the planet. It is a message that cannot be ignored or misunderstood. For the survivors in their desolate camps, for the cultists standing guard, for the soldiers and traitors in the bunker, the world vanishes. There is no sound, no light. There is only a sudden, total immersion in an alien consciousness. For a span of 60 seconds, every last human being sees the universe through the eyes of the Cygnian hegemony. They experience a flood of memories, emotions, and data that is billions of years old. It is a moment of perfect, terrifying empathy, a brief, forced enlightenment. The conflict in the bunker freezes, guns half raised, as both Vance and his former friend stare into the same shared internal abyss, their personal squabble rendered utterly insignificant. This is the climactic revelation that reframes everything. The message is a confession. The first images are of the Cygnian homeworlds, gas giants with magnificent floating cities of living crystal orbiting a brilliant blue star. They show a civilization of unimaginable age and wisdom, a people who had long ago transcended conflict and want. They were not warriors. They were gardeners, artists, and thinkers. Then the images change. A shadow appears at the edge of their home system. It is not a fleet of ships. It is a wave of pure non-existence, a fractal, consuming void that moves between the stars. A patch of mobile, weaponized entropy that unravels the very fabric of space-time as it passes. The message shows them dozens of their worlds, hundreds of billions of their people being not destroyed but erased, unmade by this silent, implacable enemy. This is the true nature of the Dark Forest. The fundamental terror of the universe is not that other civilizations are hostile competitors. It is that there are predators of such a scale that they hunt entire galaxies for sport or sustenance. The Cygnian hegemony are not the predators. They are the last refugees. For millennia, they have been running, fleeing across the galaxy, watching their ancient empire be consumed world by world. Their entire civilization has been reduced to this fleet of nomadic biomechanical arcs. They are not invaders. They are the desperate, traumatized survivors of a far greater and more terrible war. Their grand, desperate plan is laid bare. They had an ancient legend, a story of the first gardeners, a mythical race who had seeded life across the galaxy and who had built cosmic weapons of unimaginable power. The hegemony's flight was not random. They were following an ancient map to a rumoured forgotten armory. That armory was our solar system. The precursor engine on Mars was their last hope, the only known weapon that might be able to fight the Shadow. Our system was chosen for its resources. The harvest of our oceans was not an act of conquest. It was the desperate gathering of fuel for the ancient weapon. The Crimson Plague was not an act of malice. It was the fastest, most efficient way to neutralize the local fauna that was interfering with the rearming process. Our extinction was a tragic, but in their minds necessary logistical requirement for their own survival. The psionic flood of information ends. The connection is severed. The survivors across the planet are left gasping, their minds reeling from a truth that is both an absolution and a condemnation. In the Cheyenne bunker, the spell is broken. General Vance lowers his weapon. He looks across the command center at his former friend, the cultist, and sees not a traitor, but a fool, a man whose entire fanatical belief system has been shattered. The cultists worship the Harbingers as a cleansing divine force, only to learn in the most intimate way possible that their gods were just as scared and desperate as the rest of us. The final piece of the message, the one that remains burned into every human mind, is a single, clear image. It is a tactical map of our local sector of the Milky Way. On one side is a symbol representing the Mars engine now fully powered. On the other side, at the edge of the Oort cloud, is the enemy. It is a vast, silent, and impossibly large fractal wave of pure entropy, the same force as the void filament that had erased our fleet, but on the scale of a nebula. It is a wound in reality itself, and it is moving inexorably towards our solar system. The war we had fought was a meaningless skirmish. The real war, The one for the survival of this entire quadrant of the galaxy was about to begin. Vance looks at the main screen, which shows the completed harvest and the ominous, rising energy signature of the Mars engine. He speaks, not to anyone in particular, but to the dead, empty room. All of this, our entire world, it was just them stocking the armory for the real apocalypse. This is the final hook, a promise of a far greater story to come. Echoes in the dark. The 60-second psionic broadcast from the Cygnian hegemony was the final word in the war for Earth, a message that ended not with a threat, but with a shared terror. The connection severed, and the survivors, both in the bunkers and on the ravaged surface, were plunged back into the deafening silence of their broken world. The new, terrible knowledge of the true enemy, the great consuming shadow in the void, did not bring peace, but it brought a profound and horrifying clarity. It was a synthesis that brought the listeners back to a new, much starker reality. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the standoff between General Vance's loyalists and the children of the Harbinger dissolved. There were no surrenders, no arrests. The ideological chasm between them had been rendered meaningless. The cultists, who had worshipped the aliens as a divine, cleansing force, were now confronted with the reality that their gods were just frightened refugees, engaged in an act of desperate, monstrous self-preservation. Vance's soldiers, who had seen the aliens as an implacable evil enemy, now understood them as a tragic cornered civilization. They were not enemies, allies or masters. They were all simply a prelude to a much greater horror. In the quiet aftermath, the two groups began to work together, their former enmity replaced by a shared unifying purpose, to understand and to survive what was coming next. This was the new reality. Humanity was no longer a major player, but a handful of survivors sitting on a stripped, dying planet that was now on the front line of a cosmic war we could not comprehend. This new mission acknowledged the immense uncertainties while maintaining the drama of the situation. They reviewed all the events of the past months through this new, terrifying lens. The Oumuamua Scout, the camouflage fleet, the genetic plague, the planetary harvest. Every action taken by the hegemony was reinterpreted not as an act of conquest, but as a step in a desperate logistical plan to arm themselves. They had been monstrously cruel, yes, but it was the cruelty of a terrified animal chewing off its own leg to escape a trap. This left room for a sliver of something that was not quite forgiveness, but a grim understanding. The true villains remained the first gardeners, the precursors, the silent architects who had set up this entire cosmic tragedy, leaving behind a superweapon on one planet and a genetically tagged fuel source on another. Were they the ones who had attracted the great predator in the first place? Were they the cause of the very blight the hegemony was fleeing? These were the new, unanswerable questions that haunted the survivors. And yet, in the face of this absolute existential despair, a fragile new hope began to emerge. It was not the hope of victory, or even of survival in the traditional sense. It was the hope of bearing witness. The survivors, a coalition of the military remnants and the cult's former scientists, started a new project in the ruins of the bunker, codenamed Echo. Its purpose was not to fight the Shadow, they knew that was impossible, but to learn everything they could about it from the hegemony's final data transfer, and to preserve that knowledge. They began work on a deep space probe, a final message in a bottle from a dying species, designed to record everything that was about to happen and, using a shielded, faster-than-light drive based on the hegemony's own principles, to launch itself into the intergalactic void, a warning to other galaxies of the darkness that consumed ours. They re-examined the mysterious genetic sequence that had granted them immunity to the Crimson Plague. It was the precursor's alarm bell, but perhaps it was also something more. Was there a corresponding piece of precursor technology hidden on Earth, a shelter or a database that this genetic key was meant to unlock? The search for this hypothetical precursor cache became the second and most urgent goal of the Echo project. It was a faint glimmer of hope that respected the grim science of their situation. Months passed. From Earth, the survivors watched the sky. The Cygnian hegemony ignored them completely. Their work was done here. The great ocean siphons retracted into their tankers and ascended, joining the main fleet. On Mars, the colossal precursor engine, now fully fueled by the hydrogen of 1 billion years of Earth's evolution, was activated. The red planet, the subject of so much of humanity's dreams of expansion, began to glow with a fierce internal light. Then, with a silent, majestic grace that defied all known physics, it began to move. It was no longer a planet, it was a warship, a mobile fortress world, positioning itself between the coming darkness and the sun. The survivors on Earth were now nothing more than spectators. They were the mice left in the walls of a house that was about to be obliterated in a war between gods and monsters. In the final scene, General Vance records a message, the first entry in the Echo Project's archive, a final testament for a future that would likely never come. This is the final hook for any future story. "We spent our entire history," he says, his voice quiet and heavy, "looking up at the stars and wondering if we were alone. The answer, we've learned, is yes and no. We are not alone in the universe, but in the face of the great, silent and hungry darkness between the galaxies, every one of us, human, Cygnian, and whatever else might be out there, is terrified and utterly on our own. The dark forest is not a place where you hide from your neighbours. It's a place where everyone together hides from the dark."